after Reno, I'm gonna hit Scott up and ask him a question, but now I don't have to ask him a question now, but I have something else to ask him.
Right. And we are live. Scott, just for my audience, I know you, I'm sure Kareem knows you, but who are you? Talk a little bit about your journey, where you are, where you were.
Okay, well, I mean, really, I'm just an old pirate radio host, although that's the old days now. But I'm an interview host, and I'm associated with Antiwar.com. I'm now the editorial director at Antiwar.com, and I'm the founder and the director of the Libertarian Institute. And I got a great group of guys and gals over there. Well, really just one gal, but a lot of really great guys too. She's great. That's at libertarianinstitute.org. And then lately I've been writing books. I wrote one about Afghanistan called Fool's Errand in 2017. And then one on the whole terror war, all the terror wars in the Middle East from Jimmy Carter through Donald Trump is called Enough Already. And that came out in 2021. And, basically I'm just a Ron Paul guy, anti-government type with a particular focus on American imperialism.
Interesting. So one of the things I wanted to start with, because I'm curious, is talk a little bit about were you always this way on foreign policy? Were you ever a Democrat and then switched to a conservative, then a libertarian? I'm curious your evolution in your political philosophy. Where did you start versus where you are now?
I pretty much always was a libertarian because before I ever had a chance or even, felt forced to choose between the right or the left, I first of all had George Carlin telling me that was really stupid, that the right and the left are both as completely corrupt and ridiculous as each other. That's in Jammin' in New York, 92. He does just a really great job of inoculating you into feeling like you have to identify as one or the other. For me, I shouldn't talk in second person. For me, it worked like that. And then also, I was not raised to be a Reaganite. My parents were Democrats, but, my whole childhood was Reagan and Bush.
Yeah.
But then when Bill Clinton got elected, I'm not sure where I got this from, but I was hip to the fact that he was a member of all the big Rockefeller organizations in New York City before he was sworn in. There was this old chart. If you ever read the old conspiracy book, Behold a Pale Horse, and it has this big chart of the membership of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and the Bilderberg Group in the back. Well, there was an updated version of that was going around, and it had Bill Clinton
talking about in the 90s, right?
And he was a member of all three major groups. And so I'm not saying that's all where it's at, but I'm saying that was enough for me as a high school sophomore to be very inoculated against the idea that, oh, look, the boy from Hope in American democracy, even some bastard son from Hope, Arkansas could grow up to be the president one day. Yeah, sure. If he's, completely in bed with the CIA and Wall Street and all of that. Oh, and see, also, I learned very young about Ronald Reagan being a dope pusher and how, even how Nixon, before my time, before I was born, but still that Nixon was impeached for this weird burglary payoff scheme, but not for the secret illegal bombing of Cambodia and that kind of deal. So and a lot of the just movies and things growing up in the 80s are kind of very anti-government. Even Stephen King was anti-government back then. The movie Firestarter.
Oh, yes. I forgot about that.
Father, and that's the book, I guess. They're like MK Ultra victims, and they're being hunted by American intelligence, who are the boogeyman. You know what I mean? That kind of post-Vietnam War sort of attitude about the federal government. I was very much, I was raised on Public Enemy too. So I just always kind of been an anti-government guy since I was very young. And then Bill Clinton burned Waco. And then, a bunch of FBI informants blew up Oklahoma City, and the government let them all get away with it and blamed it on this one guy. And a whole team of guys who did it because of all their prior knowledge and the fact that it was their informants really who had done it. And I was hip to that from day one. From
really?
The Oklahoma bombing, I had a guy telling me, oh, there were bombs right there, and there, a real expert. So I was, what we now call a truther on that from the very beginning. So that made me extremely anti-government, and I was like a New World Order guy. I was like the John Bircher, one world government under the United Nations.
Did you watch Alex Jones at all?
Yeah, early on, not after the 90s though.
Yeah.
But and then with with the advent of the terror war, I just became a full-time Raimondo guy and fell in with the crew at antiwar.com because, in fact, as much as I love Will Grigg and as much as I learned from him as editor of the American, the John Birch magazine in the 90s, and I read a lot of Chomsky and a lot of left-wing anti-imperialist stuff too. But when I started reading Raimondo in 2001, I guess, or two, I was like, holy crap, how does this guy know all this stuff? And I just knew that he knew everything that I knew, but that none of that mattered because that's not what he was talking about. He was talking about all this other stuff. And it was about the neoconservatives. And I just didn't know who they were. Like, I knew who Bill Kristol was, but I didn't know who he was and what it mattered, and what station he had in the world or any of this. And when I started reading Raimondo, see, back then, nobody said neocons. I was pretty damn politically fluent, and the Republicans were the Republicans. And there's like born again Christian kind of rabble. And then there's the country club wasps. And, I don't know. And here now the dominant faction is this group of neoconservatives, mostly Jews and Catholics, who are not from that WASP establishment. They're not James Baker III. There's somebody else. Who are they? Well, they're the Likud party is who they are. And they're here, they have this marriage with the military industrial complex and they got their act together. And frankly, like I learned this later that there really was like an ethnic thing here where the WASPs, which means like the higher
white
level,
Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Yeah, but not even that, because you wouldn't count like the Branch Davidians, right? We're talking about
that's true.
Like Episcopalians, and like the higher social caste of Protestant Christians, right? They wouldn't let these guys be part of the Council on Foreign Relations, right? They're not part of the establishment, so they just made their own, and they made. They took over Heritage and AEI, but then they also created the Project for a New American Century and the Center for Security Policy and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and 10 more, the Committee on the Present Danger, and just on and on and on. And just to, basically create this echo chamber and this massive consensus. So now in the Reagan years, they had come in, but Baker had the instruction, keep the crazies in the basement. And they were allowed basically, if you look at Elliot Abrams and Robert Kagan down in Nicaragua, right? They're down there murdering people in Nicaragua, but they're not allowed to mess with Middle East policy, because they're just too directly connected to Ariel Sharon and Benjamin Netanyahu's party. And so, and that was true with H.W. Bush as well. And they had some influence, but they were, the order was, and this was, I guess, Scowcroft's order, I guess, in the Bush years, keep the crazies in the basement. Then in the Clinton years, they're basically out of power for 8 years. And so they're fooling around at their think tanks. And their project basically is, how do we get America into a war with Iraq?
You're saying they were contemplating that pre 9/11?
Oh, all through the 1990s. Because see, in the first Iraq war, during the war, the question was whether we're going to go all the way to Baghdad and finish off Saddam Hussein or not. In order to justify the war, they had to build him up into Adolf Hitler. Well, if he's Adolf Hitler, we're not going to let him live, are we? And then, but the answer was yes, we are, because one, the whole Arab coalition that we promised, all we're trying to do is get Iraq out of Kuwait.
Yes.
And not further. All that would have broken up. We'd have been in violation of the United Nations mandate that we're operating under and all of these things. And it would have been a disaster. In fact, I have the quote in enough already. And you can find this. If anyone types in on YouTube, say Dick Cheney, C-SPAN, 1994. And they ask him, well, geez, how come you guys wimped out and didn't go all the way to Baghdad? And Cheney very smartly says, because one, we'd have been bogged down in urban fighting, trying to hunt this guy down if we could ever find him, which is going to take a while. We would have to come up with a new regime to replace him that would have to be functional and all of this in the middle of a strange land. And we would have all of these foreign players, these countries next door would like to grab a piece. Iran would like to run off with the South, and the Turks would like to, crush the Kurds, and the Syrians, which I don't know what he's talking about here. He thought the Syrians wanted to run off with the entire west of the country. That wasn't true. But anyway, the point was that it would not be just, oh, America says and we get what we want. We would be really biting off more than we could chew if we were to do such a foolish thing as that. But so the neoconservatives, they really are, look at Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz and Scooter Libby. And stuff. They are representatives of the Likud party in Israel. That is basically their deal, man. And particularly the Netanyahu faction of Likud, because Likud even then, was split between Ariel Sharon and Netanyahu. And Ariel Sharon was an Iran hawk, and Netanyahu was the Iraq hawk. So, but the neocons in America, they were the Netanyahu guys, and they were determined to make the war in Iraq happen.
Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there was some sort of a policy paper or a document called a clean break. And essentially it was people who went to Netanyahu, brought it to him, basically saying, go ahead, explain it, talk about it that way,
Sure. So this is a group of American neoconservatives wrote this paper for Netanyahu called a clean break. And now they're not talking about invade Iraq, because Netanyahu is in no position to invade Iraq, but they're talking about if we could do a coup, if we could get rid of Saddam Hussein. But that's the bottom line, if we could get rid of Saddam Hussein. Now, for people who aren't all that familiar, pull up a map or something, okay? So you picture what I'm talking about here, because this is what they're looking at. We're talking about post-revolutionary Iran under the control of the Ayatollahs. Yes. And Iran is friends with Syria, and they're friends with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And Hezbollah in southern Lebanon is a problem for Israel. And as long as Syria is there, and in conjunction with Hezbollah, backed by Iran, then Israel, in whatever terms, in relative terms, are in a position where they're going to basically have to figure out how to appease the Arab states. And that means live up to the Oslo Accord and allow there to be at least some form of Palestinian state. Okay. But, and here's where you got to go for and I'm sorry for the pun, but the Rube Goldberg, machine that's supposed to make this happen. Here's how it goes. If we focus on overthrowing Sunni Saddam Hussein in Iraq, that won't be removing the last roadblock and adding another Shiite group to the Iranian chain. No, what will happen is we will have dominance over the Iraqi Shia, because we'll use the Hashemite king of Jordan or his cousin, and later they switched that to Ahmed Chalabi, their sock puppet, and we'll control the Iraqi Shia. And by the way, the king of Jordan has no authority over the Iraqi Shia. They're just stupid, these guys. But anyway, and we'll take our control over the Iraqi Shia, and we'll have the religious clergy down in Najaf tell Hezbollah in Lebanon to stop being friends with Iran and to stop being friends with Syria. And then Jordan will be the dominant power in Iraq in alliance with Jordan and itself and with Turkey, and will then limit the power of Syria and Hezbollah and Iran. That'll break the chain of Iranian power in the region. Now, of course, this is all making the bet that somehow the Iraqi Shiites are going to be more loyal to the Americans, the Jordanians, than they would be to their co-religionists in Iran next door, which is completely stupid. And if you go back to 1991, you might remember, or you might not, that there was the uprising after the war where, Desert Storm lasted for 6 weeks or whatever, not even. The air war and then the ground war lasted just a few days. And then in the aftermath of that, H.W. Bush urged the Iraqi Shiites and Kurds to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. And they started to do so. If you've ever seen this movie, Three Kings, it's got Marky Mark and George Clooney and Ice Cube, and they're doing a gold heist. And the setting is post-Iraq War I, southern Iraq. And it's the Shiite uprising against Saddam Hussein is in the background of that film. That'll help ground you in what I'm talking about here, if you remember. Okay, so Bush Sr. encouraged this to happen. But then when it happened, he stabbed them in the back and then allowed Saddam to keep enough tanks and attack helicopters to destroy them all, kill like 100,000 people, putting down the insurrection. So why? Well, the answer is because once the Shiites started rising up to overthrow Saddam, a group of Iraqi Shiites who had chosen Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq war back when Jimmy Carter and Saddam Hussein had started it 10 years before that, and had fled to Iran and had been Iraqi exiles and traitors inside Iran, a group called the Badr Brigade, an armed militia called the Badr Brigade of the Supreme Islamic Council. When the uprising began, they came across the border from Iran and started leading the parade toward Baghdad, which was stupid of them. They should have held back, right? They're idiots. Because as soon as they did that, Bush and Baker and Scowcroft went, oh no, and choked, and realized these are the same men who had just spent the entire 1980s backing Saddam Hussein to contain the Iranian Revolution. Now they were importing it into Iraq. So they said, well, we better not do that, and stab the revolution in the back and let Saddam crush them and win. Now it's 12 years later. Well, in fact, in this case, in the case of the clean break being written in 1996, it's 5 years later. And they're saying, if the Shiites take over, it'll be great because the Sunni Hashemite king of Jordan will tell them all what to do. It's completely ridiculous. And this is David Wormser was the principal author of it, and he became Dick Cheney's advisor. And then Richard Pearl, who's probably the most powerful and influential of the neoconservative ringleaders of that time, and Douglas Feith, who was right up in there and with the top of the group and became the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy under W. Bush and ran the Office of Special Plans where they cooked up all the lies to brainwash people and, buffalo people into supporting that war. So, and Charles Fairbanks III, and I forgot who else. There's a couple other, David Wormser's wife, My Rev. So anyway, that was the plan. Is this completely harebrained scheme. And look at what happened. They invade Iraq. And all that happened was W. Bush picked up right where his father had left off in 91. Yeah. He takes the Shiite revolution to Baghdad. And who's in charge to this day? The Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq. The Al-Hakim faction became the dominant faction among the three major Shiite factions that America put in power there. And they are to this day. In fact, there's like a split between Skiri the base and Badr the militia now, because it's just a battle of personalities. But all of these guys are essentially led by guys who lived in Iran for 20 years and are, I'm not going to say they're completely the slaves of and just the outright sock puppets of the Iranian regime, but they are the Iraqi power factions most close to Iran. Those are the ones W. Bush put in power. And see, this is why Barack Obama backed Al-Qaeda in Syria. People would say to me, geez, Scott Horton, why is Barack Obama backing Al-Qaeda in Syria? And the answer is, well, we put Iran up 2 pegs by putting their friends in power in Baghdad. Now we're trying to at least take them down 1 peg by getting rid of their guy, Assad, in Damascus. And that'll be like a consolation prize since the clean break backfired and solidified this Shiite arc of power, this Shiite crescent, as the king of Jordan called it, once they invaded. And so, Syria is now the keystone in the arc, I guess, in the arch. And that's what they said in the first place. And so that's why they went and backed the guys who had been the Sunni insurgency against us. And the worst part of it, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq War II, then became moderate rebel heroes in the attempt to overthrow Assad. And now what did they do? The Iraqi-backed, dominated faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq in Syria during that war, they said, well, screw Assad. If you know the geography of Syria, 8 of 10 cities are in the west, right? Something like that. And so they said, well, screw all that. We'll let the local Syrian guys fight Assad, and we'll just consolidate power over the entire western half of the, the entire eastern half of the country. And which
you're talking about in Syria.
State. I'm sorry.
You're talking about in Syria, right?
In Syria, in 2013. They said, look, we'll just declare our Islamic State right now. And then 1 year later, they rolled right into Western Iraq, which, the Shiites had forsaken, right? The Shiites took over Baghdad and had told Western Sunni-dominated Iraq, you guys can burn in the sun. We've got all the oil in the south and in the north. You got nothing, but screw you. What are you going to do about it? So they were, the Iraqi army was like 100% Shiite at that point, but they did not really control the western part of the country. They were AWOL behind.
This is where pretty much, I know it's not officially, but Iraq War 3 comes in 2013, right. 2014. Another extended version of that, essentially, after what was going on there in Syria.
Right. So what happens is W. Bush empowers the Shiites in Iraq. So Barack Obama empowers the Sunnis in Syria. But then that blows back into Iraq so badly that they create a bin Ladenite state, the Islamic State.
Oh my God.
Well, that's
ISIS,
right? But so then what do? They got to take the side of the Iranian Shiites again, and the Iranian-backed Shiites, and he literally had America into Crete, in Saddam Hussein's hometown. You had America flying air cover for the Iranian Quds Force on the ground, fighting against the Islamic State Caliphate that Obama had built up to spite the Shiites because DC was mad that they had given Baghdad to the Shiites before.
Which is kind of crazy to me. I actually had a bunch of
and look, this is part of why they went to war in Yemen. Was because, well, once the Shiites' friends, once Iran's friends, the Houthis took over there, the Saudis were like, look, man, you're taking our side in this right now. And they said, okay, we kind of owe you one, you know?
I don't understand that though. Why did we decide to give weapons and billions of dollars to Saudi Arabia? Why did we help them out? You know, and then they obviously destroyed Yemen's infrastructure. They destroyed water lines. They destroyed major supply systems that I mean, right now, I think the number is like up to 400,000 people died. And that might be a lower estimate. Why did we do that exactly? What were the intentions and goals of the policymakers at that time to aid Saudi Arabia in that war?
I mean, honestly, I think the first one is the one I just said there. We owed them one. We had screwed up. The Bush and Obama government had made Iran more powerful, and then trying to limit the effect of that backfired too, and they made them even more extra powerful than that. So then when their guys took over in Yemen and the Saudis stamped their feet, Barack Obama said, okay, fine, we'll back you, go ahead and attack them. And another part of it was he was seeking the Iran nuclear deal at that time. And you know, this is important because you would think that the Saudis would be very grateful that the Americans are seeking an Iranian nuclear deal. What are you going to do? You're going to lock down their nuclear program. You're going to reverse its progress and expand inspections and all these things and guarantee its civilian nature. Great. If you're a Saudi general, what higher priority in life could you possibly have than guaranteeing Iran and making nukes, right? But the thing is, that was always a hoax. Nobody thought they were making nukes because they're not making nukes. That's stupid, right? That was always just what they told the rubes. This is all about balance of power and strategy and all of this kind of crap that, you know, isn't fit for regular public consumption. So what was really going on was just trying to, you know, hem in Iranian power. And so
to help Saudi Arabia, essentially. Yeah,
but so they were worried, right, that if Barack Obama made this nuclear deal with Iran, that would be the first step on them throwing Saudi Arabia under the bus and tilting back toward Iran. After all, we did just fight 2 wars for them. Well, maybe, you know, this is the start of something. Now, look, if you understand American politics, you know that it took every last bit of political capital that Barack Obama had to pass that nuclear deal. He was not going to get on a plane and go to Tehran and make friends with the Ayatollah and abandon the Saudis. As no matter how much he resented their BS or whatever his problem was with them, he was never going to do that. That was just not in the cards. But the Saudis felt like their position in America's imperial order in the Middle East was threatened. They're number 2 dog after Israel, maybe tied with Turkey. We're really ahead of Turkey. So if we're going to abandon them, if the nuclear deal is a signal that we might abandon them and tilt back toward Iran, they wanted an assurance that that was not the case. And it was Obama's own men told the New York Times. They said, even though they knew the war would be long, bloody, and I always mess up the line, indecisive. It would be long, bloody, and indecisive, that they had to do it anyway to placate the Saudis while they were doing the Iran nuclear deal. And so
you're referring to Yemen, right? You're referring to Yemen.
That's right. Yeah,
Okay.
and they launched what, as you just correctly said, what amounted to a war of genocide. A war where, see, they didn't just go in there and bomb Houthi military positions because there wasn't much of that to bomb, right? So they just, from the very beginning of the war, they just bombed neighborhoods, apartment complexes, the waterworks, the electricity, the sewage, the farms,
Yeah.
funerals and schools and businesses and factories and just, you know, especially any kind of food. There's a potato chip factory they dropped a few bombs on just to make sure, you know, basically nobody has a damn thing to eat. It was from the very beginning. It was a war to punish the civilian population. And honestly, I mean, no lie, probably 1 million Iraqis died in Iraq War II, you know, and
100%. Definitely.
They did. And a lot of that was in the Civil War, but it was still all America's fault. And what the Americans did there also, in many cases, included war crimes and collateral damage that you wouldn't believe.
Yeah.
But,
like what Julian Assange released, right? Those videos we saw.
Sure. But in Yemen, we're talking about bombing the electricity, bombing the waterworks, bombing the hospitals, bombing the sewage and the garbage trucks and the everything, right? They have a massive cholera outbreak. They bombed the cholera hospital, right? So this is, W. Bush didn't do that, but America did with Saudi. And look, I know this guy named Nasser Arabi, who's a reporter in Yemen, who I talked to for years about this. And he said they call it the American-Saudi war. They're not fooled. They know who's the superpower and who's the client state. And so, you know, Barack Obama's men, remember in Libya, they called it leading from behind, where we call it NATO. We pretend this is a British and French war, but everybody knows America is the world empire. America is the superpower. We're number one. That's the chant, right? And these countries work for us. And so, and look, it is a matter of the tail wagging the dog, man, and the self-licking ice cream cone, where once you have a war in Yemen going, it's like a siphon or something, right? It's a perpetual motion machine. Once it's going, now you got to stop it. And look what it took for it to end. It took for the American people and the Congress to get thoroughly sick of it after like 8 years.
I know. Yeah. Trump should have ended that war. Out of all the things he could have done. That was
and the Houthis basically blowing up refinery after refinery in Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis and the Americans proving that they could not prevent that from happening. And that, you know, but it took 8 years for the thing to just finally, you know, for them to give up, basically for the Saudis and UAE to give up on their plan there. And the whole time the Americans are just on board. Barack Obama kept this going from the spring of 2015 through the beginning of 2017. And then Donald Trump came in and he kept that thing going for 4 years straight. And I know it's the New York Times, but it's a good article, man, about how Pete Navarro, his trade guy, was like the guy who determined his Yemen policy. That like, listen, there was the War Powers Resolution was passed by both houses of Congress to try to end the war, and Trump vetoed it. And he vetoed it because Raytheon, literally, not like in your hyperbole, like you just imagine and you go, yeah, I bet it was Raytheon. No, literally, yeah, that's exactly what happened. It was Raytheon, the missile making company, called Pete Navarro and said, don't turn off this spigot. This is our money. This is our welfare program. This is our, industrial plan, and pay us. And so Navarro then went to Trump and convinced him not to end the war.
Wow. And, so that literally happened. It literally happened where Raytheon actually called Peter Navarro.
Yes, sir. That's whole relationship is there. So part of it was Trump had put all these new tariffs on China. And so big business, or, in industry, heavy industry, manufacturing in the country, they were upset. And the way that Trump and Navarro looked at it was, well, one thing that we can do about that is we can funnel money directly into the military industries. And then in their mind, that'll like make industry happy. When, of course, that's not the same thing. Paying off Raytheon is not the same as paying off everybody who's losing out from tariffs against China. Now you're talking about stove companies and all kinds of things, like people making goods that consumers use, which is a different game. But in their mind, this is how they can pay off industry and keep them happy after the results of their, the negative results of their tariffs on China and their trade war against China. So, but we're talking about, look, if you were a son of a bitch and it was your job, Your job would be to go to Congress to support wars because you represent a company that makes bombs. And if the military is not clearing out their inventory and reordering more bombs,
Yeah,
then
and
your
testing
boss
weapons
isn't
and
making
testing new,
money.
and testing new
So
bombs and
that's
stuff
it.
like that.
And Obama ran out of bombs too.
Yeah, he dropped. I'll never forget this stat. Obama dropped 26,171 bombs his final year in office. 26,171 bombs in 2016.
I'd buy it. Yep.
You got any questions, Kareem, for him?
There's a lot there to unpack. I was going to ask, because I agree with Scott on everything. I follow this as well. And having family there, I wanted to kind of compare some ideas. I was the guy who asked you in Reno at the end, how can we get the same? I'm not even asking for more or the same or relative coverage about Yemen to Ukraine. What I'm interested to actually ask you now really is going back. I know you said the Likud party in Israel, like Bibi Netanyahu's party, was a driving thing. I'm also curious about what was kind of the scale between the economic things that they wanted, because I know there's economic interests that Saddam wanted to drop the dollar, Gaddafi wanted to drop the dollar, and that Assad, I think, did as well. And there was a pipeline there. So I always wonder how much of it is Israeli influence to kind of mess up the region and make it weaker, and how much of it is kind of American imperialism just to say, hey, these people are dropping the dollar, doing something economically we don't like, so we're going to change things up.
Yeah. Well, I've definitely heard it said that must be part of it. And there seems to be a correlation there where Saddam Hussein did say that and Gaddafi did say that. On the other hand, I can't say that in all of my reading about the origins of World War II, where I ever saw where any of the hawks were saying that that's what they were pissed off about. I mean, they would say things like, yeah, but Saddam backs Hamas and they attack people in Tel Aviv. Well, geez, you're kind of giving away the game there. That's not the United States, and that's not a threat to the United States. You know what I mean? But they would go ahead and admit that. But I never heard anyone admit that what they're really worried about is that Saddam is dumping the dollar and that sets a bad example. And after all, the national debt's about $20 trillion more now than it was then. So, if doing that set a bad example, that's one thing. But whether that would have really amounted to some kind of threat to American dollar hegemony at that time, I don't know. And it's true that in the case of Libya, Sidney Blumenthal, the Clinton advisor, in the emails, these aren't the leaked ones. These are the ones from the Freedom of Information Act released by the State Department, but you can find them on WikiLeaks. He says to her, the French are pissed off and worried because Gaddafi wants to create a gold dinar to plant the French franc. So even though the French are on the euro, they keep their former colonies on the franc in North Africa, and they want to prevent that. But he doesn't really provide any evidence of that. It's essentially nothing more than just a thing that Sidney Blumenthal says there. And I really don't know the extent of Gaddafi's plans. I mean, I know he had said that, but did he have the cooperation of any other states in the region and whatever? I think most other African leaders always thought Gaddafi was a blowhard and didn't really want to work with him that closely anyway.
Yeah, they've told me.
So what if it wasn't the dollar then? What do you think their main motivations were?
In Libya? Or in Iraq?
Libya, Syria, and Iraq. Let's just start with those three. If they're different, then explain the differences, or if they're the same. Go ahead.
I mean, look, I think the oil companies were not the driving force. I think the oil companies would just rather let the status quo reign and see if they can make a deal with whoever is where. Otherwise, at the least, they're gonna have to wait. I don't think that they were behind the drive to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Now, Dick Cheney had that famous meeting with the oil companies where he laid out the maps, and Judicial Watch got the maps where they show all the oil resources in Iraq. And I think that's basically Cheney trying to get them on board for here's what we're going to do, and
get the oil companies on board with the war.
And and I write all about this in Enough Already, in the motivations of the different players to start the war. So we start off talking about the neocons there, Raimondo, and talking about the neocons and all that. But if you to go back to just on the question of the motive for the war. So for W. Bush, the question really was showing that he was smarter and tougher than his father and that he was going to get reelected. And one of the things was W. Bush, the son, was one of those who said we should have gone all the way to Baghdad, Dad. And see, the problem was, if you remember back, you're too young, but for people who are old like me who remember back, that Bush Sr. won the war in February of 1991. Well, the election wasn't for another year and a half. And so he lost it. He had a 90% approval rating after that war. And then he lost the presidency to Bill Clinton. And so the obvious conclusion from just the self-interested point of view was he should have gone all the way to Baghdad. Then you'd have been in the middle of a war and you would have won the election. Oh. Now, all the American GIs who would have had to get blown up to death and all of that, forget that. Who cares about that? They're just the help anyway, right? The question is, how do you get reelected? And then, so when W. Bush told him, you should go all the way to Baghdad, it'll help you win the election. And then he didn't go all the way to Baghdad, and then he lost the election. And then W. Bush, this is like Paul Wolfowitz. See, I was right about something one time. Oh, great. Now, everybody has to listen to this guy. Now, this is like, iron law written in stone. You have to do this now. This is the project. And W. Bush told a reporter named Mickey Herskowitz that, look, if I'm the president, if I have a chance to attack Iraq, I'm going to, because what you need to do is you need to have a small war and pick on a small country and get into a short, successful war. And then that way you make sure and get reelected. And then you can really accomplish your domestic agenda in your second term. And that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to be a great president, blah, blah, blah. And they try to dispute that quote, but then Bush Sr. gave that same guy, Mickey Herskowitz, the contract to write the biography of his father, Prescott, after that. So he must not have lied that bad. But anyway, now Dick Cheney had another problem. Dick Cheney is the same guy who, as I told you before, explained in perfectly rational terms why not to go all the way to Baghdad. And I'm not sure. I think he didn't want to go. I think he agreed with Baker and Bush and Scowcroft not to go to Baghdad then. I think in the retelling, maybe he was always a hawk, but I'm not sure.
You mean in the first Iraq war, right?
In the first Iraq war, right. But so he spent the 1990s or a big part of it, as the CEO of Halliburton. Now, Halliburton is not an oil company. They're an oil services company. They basically do construction for oil firms. I don't know if they do offshore rigs, but they do pipelines and this kind of thing. A construction company. Kellogg Brown and Root, I guess, is the construction company that's under Halliburton there. So the reason they hired Dick Cheney was because he was a former Secretary of Defense, and they thought that this guy will get us rich because he's got all these connections with the federal government. Yeah. But the thing is, he knew about corrupt ties to a degree, I guess, but he didn't know anything about business. So Dick Cheney, as CEO of Halliburton, had this guy who was his right-hand man. I forget the guy's name, who was supposed to take care of everything. And what they did was Cheney and his right-hand man, they bought a company called Dresser Industries right before, like a week before the verdicts started coming in on literally billions of dollars in asbestos cancer claims against Dresser.
Against who?
Against Dresser Industries, which Halliburton bought, Dick Cheney bought about a week before they started getting slaughtered and the verdict started coming in. And so he and his guy had done their diligence and realized, holy crap, these guys are up to their eyebrows in cancer lawsuits right now that they're going to lose. They would not have done that, but they did that. And so clearly he had a motive to make that up to Halliburton. That if he could get us into a big war, then he could put them on the army dole for running their base, building and running their bases. And
you said that company that Halliburton acquired was called Dresser?
Yes.
Okay. Just want to look that up real quick.
It's all in the book. And so that was, I believe, his big deal was he owed these guys big time. And then you have Donald Rumsfeld. He had been the Secretary of Defense before. And
under Reagan, right?
Cared about Iraq. I'm sorry?
Under Reagan, correct?
No, under Gerald Ford.
Gerald Ford, okay.
Yeah. And so, and he was the top guy, and Cheney worked for him back then. And then they had a falling out because Cheney didn't support him in the primaries in 88, I think it was, or in 80. And they'd had a falling out. But anyway, so Cheney brought Rumsfeld back. And so Rumsfeld, he had, his priority basically was really whipping the Pentagon into shape. And at that time, there was a big debate about the transformation of the military and what is the military going to look like in the 21st century. And there were these different concepts. And his concept was, I forgot what the jargon was, but essentially to build up the Air Force and Special Operations Command at the expense of the Army. Because we don't want to go and stay. We want to be light and fast and knock off we don't like and then move on to the next one, kind of thing. And, people make a big deal, and they should, but in the wrong context, about the fact that Donald Rumsfeld gave a speech on September the 10th, 2001, about how the Pentagon can't find $3 trillion.
Yes, I remember that. Yes.
And everybody says like, oh yeah, that's the secret money that Rumsfeld spent on 9/11. And he was just teasing you by giving that speech or something. What's the point of that? No, what it was, that was Rumsfeld beating the Army over the head and saying that you guys are a bunch of chumps and you're telling me you can't track $3 trillion. Well, I'm telling you, I'm taking your responsibilities away from you and you're going to sit there and take it because of what failures you are. That's what the speech was about.
He used it as a pretext to blame the Army, essentially.
Yeah,
is what you're saying?
Was mostly them. Them in the Air Force.
One of my theories about that is it possible that the $3 trillion could have been used in some sort of black budget type thing?
Yeah, look, a lot of it was embezzled, I'm sure, but basically, It's not just bad bookkeeping. It's not that there's literally $3 trillion that went somewhere, but nobody knows, and they built a secret underground palace or whatever. You know what I mean? It's not that. Yeah. It's just, a lot of people stole a lot of it and overpaid for contracts, and just things were never accounted for. Things were billed 7 times. There's no one in charge, right? The whole thing is just, but it doesn't mean that there is a chunk of $3 trillion that went here or there.
Yeah.
But it was a matter of, in fact, there's a great article at The Nation that explains a lot of the bad bookkeeping a few years ago. I can't remember the guy's name. I interviewed him about it. But they have jargon for the different kinds of overruns and the different kind of double charges and whatever like that. But anyway, so Rumsfeld's idea was that going after the Taliban in Afghanistan, not so much to Osama, but going after the Taliban and going after Saddam in Iraq, these are like proof of concept that we're going to going after Iraq is going to be like a Lockheed commercial, man. We're going to go in there. We're going to shock and awe the crap out of them with our, superior air forces and our satellite guided bombs. And then we're going to send in our, a small part of the Army with special ops as the tip of the spear to change the regime. And then we're going to get the hell out. And you can find where Rumsfeld said, okay, we did it. Let's go. We don't want to occupy this place, pretty early on. And I think a lot of the neoconservatives actually agreed with that too. It was more the State Department.
In Iraq or Afghanistan?
We got to stay forever. And
are you talking about Iraq or Afghanistan?
Yeah, Iraq. Well, Iraq. Yeah, Afghanistan too was, this is one of the things that Rumsfeld wanted to do, was prove that they could do this light and fast special ops combined with air power and then move, that's what they would say, light and fast, So that was his role. So you have Bush has his own, and Karl Rove, of course, was with Bush. Karl Rove's charge was getting Bush reelected. Well, getting us into a war is how to get Bush reelected. And that was that. And then you have the neocons. And the neocons are there. They're the cross between the Israel lobby and the military industrial complex. Remember when I said that they were not allowed at the Council on Foreign Relations, which was like the WASPy, oil men, and bankers, right? Well, so the neoconservatives were like intellectuals without a home. and the military industrial complex was, a flea trying to wag the dog, but they didn't have the intellectual support that they needed to push their preferred policies, right? And so they made this alliance in the 1970s where the, Northrop Grumman and Lockheed and so forth would pay for these think tanks for the neocons to sit around and write their papers and write their studies and justify a more, compared to the Council on Foreign Relations, a more right-wing nationalist and unilateralist foreign policy, and one, of course, that particularly favors Israel.
And it was Karl Rove, who I think he cited in the 90s, the Pentagon chief of staff that basically said terrorism, I could be wrong in this quote, but I'm pretty sure I'm on point. Terrorism is a small price to pay for being a superpower. Now, this was before 9/11. This was before Iraq too.
Well, that's not Rove.
I'm saying Rove was quoting. Quote, yeah.
No, the quote is from. I'm sorry, the guy's last name is escaping me, but he wrote it in the Weekly Standard, Bill Kristol's magazine, and he wrote it shortly after September 11th. The article is about kind of like, how do we drop the ball here? How is this attack able to be successful and so forth? And he quotes an anonymous, he doesn't say the name, but he says it's a senior special operations commander in the 1990s. Told him that basically it was like a cliche, a saying around the Pentagon that, hey, terrorism's a small price to pay for being a superpower. Because they're looking at it in terms of like, well, what are they going to do? Truck bomb an embassy and kill a couple of hundred people? We're the superpower. We get to do any and everything, but we got to suffer some truck bombings here and there. Big deal was basically the way they were looking at it.
So looking back at, our involvement with Afghanistan in the 80s, I think the war ended in 89. How much of that do you think contributed to the later events of Afghanistan too, and the later events in the Middle East? Because from what I understand, the United States had this operation called Operation Cyclone. They went into Afghanistan and armed various, including Osama bin Laden, but the Mujahideen in the 80s, which then after we got out of Afghanistan, after the Soviet Union's pretty much, left and then obviously collapsed later on, that there was, their country went into civil war. There was chaos. A lot of their country was destroyed. And there was some resentment among the Mujahideen and people in Afghanistan for us essentially just leaving them to dry. And then I'm pretty sure it was part of Osama bin Laden's letter. He wrote some sort of memo or letter saying why he bombed us and all the reasons. I'm pretty sure that was one of the reasons. And the bases, I think he did quote the bases in Saudi Arabia as well. I'm pretty sure he said that as part of the reasons why he wanted to attack the United States. I think there was also, I could be wrong this, but in the late 90s, Osama bin Laden actually wrote a declaration of war, basically saying, this is why we want to destroy the United States. This is why we don't like them. And I wonder, did that fall on deaf ears? I don't understand that.
Well, look, I mean, you're right about most of that. The fact of the matter is, if you go back to the end of the Jimmy Carter years, he did 4 years there, 77 through 81. And, he had these two major policies. After the Iranian Revolution, he was essentially embarrassed, and so sponsored Iraq's invasion of Iran the next year. And they had a plan to bait Russia into invading Afghanistan. They started backing the Mujahideen in order to provoke the Soviets into invading. As Brzezinski later said, well, we knowingly increased the probability that they would. And although when the Soviets invaded, I'm not so sure that was in response to American provocation as much as just they had to overthrow their own sock puppet and replace him. And had their own problems there. But anyway, they did invade in Christmas 79. And then, yes, America poured $1 billion in, or a few billion, $4 or $5 billion in, and the Saudis matched it dollar for dollar. And they backed the Afghan Mujahideen, which is mostly the Pashtun resistance against the Tajik communists backed by the Soviet Union. And they backed what was called the Arab Afghan Army, which had really begun in the 1970s as the Safari Club, which was, basically using Mujahideen to do covert action against communists in Africa. After the Church Committee scandal and all that in Congress had kind of curtailed the CIA's spending and activities, they just started outsourcing more and more of it to the Saudis. So that was kind of the origin of that. Then this was their big break, right? Was they built this huge Arab Afghan army to fight against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and which worked, right? The Soviet Union left defeated at the end of 1989. And within 2 years, they didn't even exist anymore. And you ask the Reaganites or even Hillary Clinton, they'll tell you that, yep, they believe, and I think correctly, that the stress of the Afghan war, made more stressful by American support for the Mujahideen and the Arab Afghan army, helped to break the back of the Soviet Union. It helped to demoralize the country and destabilize and undermine faith in the communist regime and help lead to the fall of the Soviet Empire. Well, the jihadists thought that too. And they were the ones who did the fighting. So they took all the credit. They didn't say good old Ronald Reagan brought down the Soviet Union. They said, we did it. Us and Allah and our AK-47s did it, never mind the CIA's help. So then now the narrative about us abandoning them is not true. George H.W. Bush continued to back them, especially, the CIA-backed Gulbuddin Hekmatyar into the Clinton years.
Okay.
But then Bill Clinton, as I document in excruciating detail in my forthcoming book, Provoked, he backed the Mujahideen fighters in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Chechnya all through the 1990s, even as they're already attacking us. And the first real Al-Qaeda attack on the United States was in 1990 in New York City. They assassinated a right-wing Israeli rabbi named Rabbi Kahane from the Koch Party, which was banned by the Israeli Supreme Court for being fascist. And they proposed expelling all Arabs from all greater Israel, millions of people from the West Bank and all of that, and Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. And anyway, so he was assassinated, and that was the first one. I think bin Laden even helped pay his legal bills. And then they blew up the World Trade Center in 1993 and almost succeeded in toppling one tower over into the other. If they just parked the truck about 30 feet away, they could have killed 20 or 30,000 people in one shot there. And that was when Bill Clinton had just been sworn into power a month and a week before. And then 2 days later, they raided the Branch Davidians. So everybody's attention turned to that. And everybody didn't really imagine that. Hey, man, they almost knocked one tower.
Do you think that was done intentionally? Do you think there was that? No. Okay.
They had been planning to do the Waco raid for a long time.
Yeah.
But it just turned out that, because of the siege and everything, it just attracted all that attention. And quite frankly, like, oh, man, we gotta learn a bunch of Arab names and all this stuff. Like, it just journalists didn't want to talk about it. Just people didn't want to get into it. It was better, hopefully ignore it, make it go away or something. But then, I'm sorry to go through the whole list, but
no, go ahead.
They attacked the National Guard, American National Guard trainers in Saudi Arabia in 95. They attacked the Cobar Towers in 96, where they killed 19 American airmen, bombing Iraq from bases in Saudi. And Bill Clinton and the FBI blamed it on Iran and said it was Iranian-backed Saudi Hezbollah that did it. Yeah, right. It was Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed that did it. And, the guy that ended up being the chief planner of the September 11th attack. Well, he had just got back from Bosnia, where he fought on Bill Clinton's side.
Yeah.
And two of the hijackers, famously, in fact, there's new developments along this, although we've known a lot of this for a long time, about the Saudi embassy's support for these two Al-Qaeda guys that the CIA had followed from Malaysia to Bangkok straight to LAX, who'd been living in the country for 18 months and were the guys who crashed Flight 77 into the Pentagon. Of course, every idiot who ran around screaming about the missile that hit the Pentagon were doing the CIA's dirty work and covering for them, because who cares who the pilots of the plane were that hit the Pentagon if it was just this made up missile?
Yeah, that's a good point right there.
Yeah, it is. Well, people are stupid. So anyway, like Donald Rumsfeld's going to shoot a missile at a building that he is sitting in.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't.
And don't they usually those people who have that theory link it to the $1 trillion? Like they're like, oh, the $1 trillion paid for the missile.
It's all garbage, dude.
Yeah,
it's all garbage. Look, if it was an inside job in terms of they wanted it to happen. I mean, right now, the explanation that makes a lot of sense is that the CIA and the Saudis were trying to flip these guys and make them assets. And then it happened on their watch anyway. We saw that happen in Oklahoma City. You know, these things do happen. You could jump to the conclusion and say, no, it's because they wanted the attack to happen because look how bad they exploited it. You could say the same about Oklahoma City, but I don't think that's a fair conclusion to jump to necessarily. It looks more like the CIA guys who were trying to recruit those guys were not really spies. They were the ladies, analysts over at the Alex station. Well, Rich Blee and the others too, but they didn't really know what they were doing. And so they dropped the ball and the attack happened. But the point is, those two guys, they had fought for Bill Clinton in Bosnia. That was how they earned their stripes as, you know, OG Mujahideen was fighting on the Muslim side in the Bosnian War, the side that America took. And then Bill Clinton also backed them. Oh, and I went off the list there, but because Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, I mentioned, that had helped blow up Cobar Towers. But then they did the Africa embassies in 98 in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Nairobi, Kenya, and the USS Cole in 2000, which Bill Clinton did nothing. You know, they did after the embassy attack. He launched cruise missiles at an antibiotics factory. You know, the Republicans go, oh, an aspirin factory. No, it was an antibiotics factory in about, you know, 10,
in Sudan. Are you talking about the one in Sudan, right?
In Sudan, right?
Yes, we were just talking about that.
Yep, and empty training camps in Afghanistan in 98. So here, our government under Reagan and Bush created these monsters. Then Clinton continues to use them even as they're attacking us over and over again throughout his presidency. You know, when Vladimir Putin declared war on Ukraine, in his declaration of war, he said, we know you backed the terrorists against us in Chechnya. You think we don't know that? You think we've forgotten that? Now, to Americans, and in fact, he said this, I think twice. I think both times he brought this up, he begins it with, now, let's be adults about this. America backed the terrorists in Chechnya, right? And so, in other words, what he's saying is, don't call me a conspiracy theorist, man. I was a KGB guy, and I was in charge of that war, and I know what you guys were up to there. And yeah, I still hold a grudge against that, right? Like, remember Charlie Savage and the Russia bounties hoax, where the New York Times pretended in the summer of 2020 that the Russians—
Yeah, during the debates. I remember that, yep.
And we're being told that they paid them a few times, a few dollars to kill a few guys. And it was like World War III had broken out. And the whole thing was a lie to Charlie Savage's permanent disgrace that he'll never live down. But the Americans absolutely flipped out about that. Well, what if it was really true that they had been backing the Mujahideen against us the whole time in that war? In fact, we had switched sides in that war. We were fighting on the Russian side, backing the Tajik communists against the Mujahideen, so they wouldn't have done that. But I'm just saying, you know, as a metaphor, that's what America did to them in Chechnya. You know, in Kosovo and in Bosnia, that was not directly against the Russians, but it was against their friends, the Serbs. And it still was treason against the American people backing these guys. And I show in Fool's Errand, I got the footnotes, and I cite it in both books, that Bill Clinton and his two Democratic congressman friends, Tom Lantos and Brad Sherman, all three, after September 11th, said something very close to, how could those Muslims attack us after everything we've done for them lately? In other words, they believe that they— in fact, I have this in my research. I forget if this is in the book, but I got to make sure this is in the book. Something tells me I skipped this, but I need to go back and find this note, because I have this note when I was researching about the armed support for the Mujahideen in Bosnia, where they said a couple of different times, well, you know, a lot of these guys are really mad at us for Iraq War I, so we owe them one. I'm going to make it up to them that we did Iraq War I by backing them in Bosnia, and that'll make them like us, right? So this is, I think, this is a worry right now, and go ahead and quote me, and I've tried to say this occasionally, at least, so people will remember. I don't think Al-Qaeda's war against the United States is over. And the fact that we took their side in Syria meant that they accepted our help for a time. But has the American order in the Middle East completely ended? Or do we stop backing the kings and sultans and potentates around there? Do we stop backing Israel? Have we killed 2 million something people since bin Laden declared war over a couple of 100,000? I think, and if you look at the number of new terrorists that were, Mujahideen fighters that came from Iraq War II and Syria, and now the war in Yemen as well. Look, when we talk about the war in Yemen, we're talking about, just like in Syria, outright taking Al-Qaeda's side, right? W. Bush gave Western Iraq to Al-Qaeda because he's stupid. But Barack Obama deliberately took Al-Qaeda's side in Syria and in Yemen and built them up into, I don't want to over exaggerate like a war hawk to justify intervention. But it's got to be, high thousands, low tens of thousands of real ass mujahideen. It's not like everybody who ever went and fought in Afghanistan became an Al-Qaeda terrorist, right? Not everyone who ever went and fought in Iraq War II or Syria is going to stay a dedicated international jihadist trying to blow up the Statue of Liberty or whatever. But some of them are. And just because our government has supported them in Syria and Yemen, and even to a degree, they've been fighting in Ukraine these last few years since the coup of 14 in limited numbers. That doesn't buy their loyalty. We learned that lesson from September 11th. Backing them in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Chechnya didn't buy their loyalty and prevent September 11th. So why would we think that after all the chaos of the last 20 years that, if we just do them a favor in the Idlib province, we owe them one, then forgive us and be loyal American foot soldiers. Remember, Al-Qaeda doesn't come from the axis of evil. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Al-Qaeda all comes from Egypt and Saudi Arabia, countries that are too close of allies of the United States. And
interesting.
Represented by their people for that reason. So, but that means ultimately they're on the same side as us in the Sunni Shiite divide. Most of the time, it means they're useful foot soldiers for the Americans. They hate the Russians. We can use them against Russia again and again. So we have a lot of interests in common. We're strategic allies, even when we're not literal allies with the Mujahideen. It's just that some of the time they kill us by the thousands because they resent what our government does to other people when they're not supporting them.
Interesting. One of the things I wanted to point out that me and Kareem talked about, but I think it's worth bringing up again, is that we talked about the bombing of the pharmaceutical company in Sudan that, they made aspirin, but they made more than just aspirin. But
it was antibiotics. Yeah.
It was antibiotics, and it was bad.
There were thousands of excess deaths from that.
Yeah. And one of the craziest things is that I found out, me and Kareem found out, is that was the first example of that this is what it said, of the U.S. bombing a country that we were not at war with, nor had a, what is it called? Use of force authorization.
Oh, I doubt that. America bombs whoever they want all the time, but
But the thing that
Panama and Grenada without any authorization whatsoever.
Yeah, so maybe it's not the case. That's what said on the article. But one of the things is that I think it was 1990. It was either 1990 or 1992. Sudan attacked what was called the U.S. Cole. Are you familiar with that?
Attacked the what?
The U.S. Cole, the incident of the U.S. Cole attacks.
Oh, no. That was Al-Qaeda terrorists did that in Yemen in the year 2000.
Okay. Well, one of the things I saw on the Wikipedia page is that the U.S., after the U.S. Cole was bombed, this was recently within the last year, we had Sudan, and I'm not sure why this is, but we had Sudan basically pay us millions and millions of dollars to pay for the damages and victims of the U.S. Cole. So if it wasn't Sudan that did it, that doesn't make much sense.
No, I don't know what's going on there, but it was the national government of Sudan was never allied with Al-Qaeda against the United States and would never have done something like that. Yeah, that's not right. So bin Laden did live there for a while after he got kicked out of Saudi Arabia, but then Bill Clinton asked the government of Sudan to kick him out of the country in 1996, which is exactly what they did, and he went to Afghanistan. And this is
what I was talking about right here. Sudan ordered to pay $7.96 million for USS Cole attack. A federal judge on Wednesday ordered Sudan to pay $7.96 million to the families 17 sailors killed in the 2000 terrorist attack on the USS Cole. The families had sought $105 million, but the U.S. District Judge Robert G. Dumar said
part where it explains their responsibility for it. I've never heard that, honestly.
You know, we literally just covered this. I think the last or the stream before that.
I mean, I know that judges in New York fined for all kinds of ridiculous things, and they've blamed Iran for September 11th and God knows what.
Yeah, I'm not saying this is true, and you have a lot more expertise on this, but
I don't know.
I'm going to get to this part right here. The families accused Sudan's government of providing support, including money and training that allowed Al-Qaeda to attack and destroy. So yeah, you were right. While it was in the harbor of Aden and Yemen on October 12, 2000. In March, Dumar found the African country liable for the attack on the now repaired Navy destroyer. His ruling Wednesday reaffirmed those findings. I was a little bit disappointed in the overall ruling because we figured we were going to get more, but I'm happy that part of the case is over, said Lori Triplett of Suffolk.
In other words, they held some BS civil suit with the defendants in absentia. And the judge went with some, neocon think tank report that said, oh, well, they had some training camp in Sudan or something. So their national government owes us money. That's a bunch of crap.
Yeah. My point about, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, they do stuff like that all the time. You get federal judges.
I'm definitely not surprised.
There are a lot of times where you'll go, what is that? That doesn't make any sense. What's the proof of that? And they'll go, well, a federal judge in New York said it. And well, whatever, dude.
That's why I was kind of
other than that, because you get that all the time.
Yeah, I know. I was weirded out because I was like, I didn't know that they had direct involvement with the attack. The reason why I brought it up is because as we were talking about before, when we destroyed one of their major pharmacies, we didn't pay them back any money. We destroyed one of their pharmacies, killed, I think it was like 20 to 30 people or something like that. And like you said, antibiotics, yet they have to pay us. They have to pay the families. And there was a bit of the money going to the United States for the Cole attack. It's so backwards. It's so hypocritical to have that happen, because when I think about it, how poor of a country is Sudan? I'm not saying they're the poorest country in the world, but to make them pay money for an attack that, as you say, and I'm definitely not going to debate you on it, that was maybe at the very least loosely connected with Al-Qaeda. Like, that just doesn't make any sense to me.
Oh, yeah. No, Al-Qaeda had nothing to do with that antibiotics factory whatsoever. It was just a total hoax that they were accused of manufacturing.
Yeah, they said that. They said that at first. That was the pretext, correct? That was the pretext they used for it.
That Bin Laden owned it, and they were making chemical weapons. Well, Bin Laden didn't own it, and they weren't making chemical weapons. And I even was watching C-SPAN that night, and they piped in live Sudanese TV, and there's the president of Sudan in a three-piece suit and wingtips walking through the rubble of the factory, going, well. Wow. I don't smell any germ weapons or chemical weapons here. I think we're all safe, guys. So that was, an obvious hoax from the very, very beginning.
And I'm actually interested to hear you unpack Sudan, because I've heard you do a really good job with Somalia, Yemen, Iraq, and that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to even get the history of that, because there's so I see a Russian side, I see an American side, I see civil war. My conclusion, and I don't know if this is yours as well, is just if America leaves things alone, if Russia leaves if there's no foreign intervention in the country, then I would like them to see different tribes, like, in Somalia, just get along with their own customary law, and that'd be the best thing.
Yeah. I mean, if you're talking about the current civil war that's being fought in Sudan right now, I don't know who's who or what's going on. I'm way behind on that. I'm writing a history book about all this Russia stuff. And, I know we're covering it constantly at antiwar.com, but I have not been up to date on it.
Okay. Well, let's move to, we talked about it a little bit before we started the podcast, but let's move to Ukraine, because one of the things I was telling Scott before we started the live stream was that I don't know if there was a person before you, but he was one of the first people I could find talking about the coup, CIA-led coup with NGOs and the Endowment for Democracy, I think that's what it was called, in Ukraine. In 2014, he was talking about it. He talked about it from 2015. He talked about it in the Bill Kristol debate. He talked about it in various speeches in 2020. So talk about that and what happened, because what you made me aware of this is there was actually a coup. I don't know if it was the same level, but there was a similar coup in 2004 as well, not just 2014.
Right. So in 2004, in W. Bush years, it was called the Orange Revolution. And what happened was there was an election where Kuchma was the previous president, and his, successor, handpicked guy was Viktor Yanukovych. And they claimed that he rigged the election. And I don't know if he did or not. Maybe the guy stuffed some ballots. It's not like he had angels preventing him from doing such thing.
Yeah.
But that was the claim. And then what they did was, it's the same scam that they had done in Georgia in 2003, the year before, was you have all the NGOs announce the results of their exit polls immediately. And then you pretend that the exit polls have got to be the real numbers, and the election numbers that come in, when they're so different than the exit polls, that proves how fake the real numbers are. And we go with the exit polls instead of the actual vote tallies. And then the side that loses essentially insists that they won and have their way anyway, and cancel the results of the election and have their way anyway. That was what happened with the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003. And that was the template that they used again in Ukraine in 2004. And so they eventually got the Supreme Court to rule that the election was invalid and hold a new election.
Wow.
And this time the good guys won. And that was,
wow. So it was essentially close to identical to 2004. Yeah, I did not know that. So that was essentially a coup in 2004. That's just insane,
that's
dude.
right. And it was
insane.
And it was the same groups, the NED and the George Soros back groups that had paid millions of dollars to all of a sudden, everybody's got an orange banner, and there's these giant, full screen, flat screen TVs, and everybody's got food, and there's porta potties, and there's, whatever everybody needs to keep the thing going until they get their way. Millions and millions and millions of dollars in support came flooding in. So what happens though is basically the couple that took power at that time, Yushchenko and Timoshenko, they were so corrupt, they got run out. And the same guy, Yanukovych, was elected back to power he became prime minister, I think in 2008, and then became president in 2010, was elected president in 2010 in a free and fair election. The EU verified it and rubber stamped it and everything. And it was a landslide too. He whooped, his closest competitor was Yulia Tymoshenko, the gas princess from the Orange Revolution, and he crushed her completely. And this is the guy they overthrew in 2014. So what happened was he was negotiating to move west. Even though he was from the Party of Regions, he was actually trying to, play a much more neutral role and even a Western leaning role.
You're talking about Yanukovych, right?
Yanukovych.
Okay.
And he was going to sign an association deal with the EU, but they and the IMF were driving a really hard bargain in terms of austerity and interest rates. And they would only loan him not nearly enough compared to what he thought he needed to be able to hold the country together for the short term. So the Russians came in and said, well, we'll give you $15 billion and a discount on your gas if you sign a deal with us instead of them. And so he went with Russia because they, offered a better deal. Well, that really pissed off, the people in the west of the country. Not that they're all so determined to go with the EU, but just they saw this as a capitulation to the Russians, and not just not moving west, but moving east instead, and really reacted strongly against that. And then from the literal absolute very beginning, the very first guy who wrote on Facebook, come on, guys, let's all go to the Maidan and start a protest movement, was a guy on the payroll of George Soros.
Really?
From TV. And
I did not know that.
So, then that was at the end of November. And then all through the end of November, all through December of 13 and into January and February of 14, the Americans, through the National Endowment for Democracy and the George Soros backed and Pierre Omidyar backed groups, poured millions of dollars in, again, to keep this protest movement going through the dead of winter. Keeping heaters, keeping concerts, playing movies, and keeping the food coming, and again the porta potties and all the services that people need to be able to stay out and get the thing going for months. And then they essentially provoked a street fight. The radical right, including some avowed neo-Nazis, picked a street fight with the police to bring the crisis to a head. And then that was essentially the excuse for the Americans and and the Europeans tell Yanukovych that he had to sign this deal and agree to new elections and to pull his police back. Well, the protest movement didn't live up to their side of the agreement. And in fact, when the protest leaders who had signed the agreement said, okay, everybody, here's the deal we just made, a Nazi, in fact, the same guy who had been in charge of one of the sniper teams killing cops earlier that day, ran up onto the stage and grabbed the mic and said, hell no, we're not doing that. And if Yanukovych isn't gone by 10 a.m., I swear to God, we're going to kill him. And we got our guns and we're on our way. Well, Yanukovych was living up to his side of the deal, so he had pulled all his police back. The protesters were supposed to go home. Well, now he pulled his police back, and I guess the cops got the word that, hey, we're quitting. Don't do nothing. Don't go to work tomorrow, whatever. So basically, when he pulled the cops back, boy, did they pull all the way back. They were gone. And so then the protesters were, ransacking, looking for the guy and ransacking the national government buildings there. And so he fled to Kyiv and then on to Russia from there. And so it was essentially an international, especially American-backed coup, but expressed on the ground in the form of a right-wing Nazi street push.
That's insane.
And
these are the same people who are at, I'm not going to say, again, I want to be very specific, not the majority, but a minority of them are at the forefront of this current war now, leading the charge with the modern Ukraine war. So,
well, yeah, I mean, you're skipping ahead because the war broke out almost immediately, because once they did this coup, the new government threatened to kick the Russians out of their naval base at Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. So the Russians just seized it and annexed it. And with the support of the population of the peninsula, by the way, in super majorities. Not that that's perfect, but it's better than, super majorities wanting to leave Russia and having to stay with Ukraine. And then John Brennan, the CIA director, came to town, and shortly after, the new government declared a war on terrorism and attacked the East.
You're talking about the Ukrainian government, right?
The Ukrainian government in Kiev attacked the Donbass, where the Russians were involved with this. It wasn't just locals, but still they were provoked. I'm not saying it's right, but it is what it is. That they said, look, if you guys are going to overthrow the government in Kiev and, the elected government, well, then, and occupy all these buildings, well, we're just going to occupy all these buildings here and refuse to accept your authority. And they just started bombing them. Kiev just attacked them.
Wow.
And, the war broke out. And it was a vicious war. The first year of the war in 2014, something like 10,000 people were killed just in the first year of the war. And in two different cases, the Russians evidently, I don't know, it seems like I got enough different sources claiming, if not exactly demonstrating, that the Russians did send special operations forces across in August of 14 and in February of 15 in order to win two essentially massive battles at the Ukrainians' expense, leading to the Minsk I and Minsk II peace deals of November 14 and then February 15. And so these peace deals, they were run by Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande from Germany and France, made the deal with Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, and with Vladimir Putin, but with a rubber stamp from Barack Obama and the UN Security Council. And it was supposed to end the war. They were supposed to give essentially strong federalism, like amounting to statehood, to the Donbass. They would remain in Ukraine, but they would be largely independent. The leaders of the, autonomist movement, if you want to call it that, in the East, they asked Russia to absorb the Donbass and to annex them in 2014. In 14. And I was going to say 15, but maybe again in 15, but certainly in 14. And Putin told them no. He had no interest in absorbing the Donbass. He would help them to keep Kiev out, but he did not want to make them part of the Russian Federation. He was, and look, and you could say from the most cynical point of view, right? Like maybe the guy has an unlimited appetite for land, if you say so, I guess, for the sake of argument. But the point is here, he saw his advantage in leaving the Donbass inside Ukraine. After all, if it's something like a 50-50 split, if he absorbs 10% of 50%. Well, now the anti-Russian factions are going to win every election, right? Where his guys keep winning, or his friends, people friendly to Russia keep winning when they have a fair election. If he goes and absorbs a huge part of the east of the country, he's costing himself the ability to really have any more influence inside Ukraine. So I think he wanted to try to go back to something like the status quo ante, but he just never could do it. And the Americans insisted. And we know now, because and honestly, there was an argument out, well, maybe they're just saying that now, kind of in retrospect, justifying themselves. But no, man, we've got multiple statements from Angela Merkel, two from Merkel, one from Holland, one from Poroshenko, and one from Zelensky, all saying that we never meant to live by the Minsk deals. We never were going to implement them. That was always just a scam while we took the time to build up our military force.
They said that.
Yeah, they all said that now in the last half a year. They've all said that.
Really?
Which really goes to undermine the strength of their ability to negotiate with Russia going forward here, where they're, avowedly saying outright to the newspapers that, like, yeah, we told that sucker Putin what we thought he needed to hear so that we could get away with what we were trying to get away with. And then we shook hands and signed a treaty on it. You know what I mean? Not exactly a treaty, but still, for them to now turn around and go, oh, yeah, no, we were just playing him for a sucker. I think really.
Do you think that's a true statement, or do you think they're saying that to sort of a boast? Right.
So at first I thought that maybe they're just saying that now because, he's the devil, and Angela Merkel, you were a fool to ever make a deal with him, and look at how he's taking advantage of you. So then she's saying, no, I never meant it. I was just building up Ukraine, and look how much stronger Ukraine's army is now, and that's thanks to me. And that sounds like maybe just a rationalization, right? A defensive rationalization. But she said it twice, and then Francois Holland confirmed that, that's true. And then Petro Poroshenko and then Vladimir Zelensky all have said the same thing. And not being asked, hey, this guy said this, is that right? But just in their own context, bringing it up. Poroshenko said, like, come on, what kind of traitor would I be if I had not called a ceasefire and given the army a chance to rebuild itself? Otherwise, we would have lost outright. I was able to call timeout before we lost, so that makes me a hero.
And build up arms and whatnot.
Right, that's right. And
I'll be right back. I'm going to use the bathroom, Kareem. If you want to ask any questions, go for it. Right back.
Go ahead. All right, cool. I had actually two questions about that. I really like your analysis of all this stuff because it is quite in depth. I've been looking into a couple things, and one, I think your Ukraine thing is spot on. Because after the coup happened, then now look at the situation we're at. I'm curious, though, actually, because I haven't read antiwar.com. I'm doing some local races here because I decide once the Mises Caucus takes over, if we don't run local stuff, then kind of what's the point? Then
right, yeah, great.
Like, okay, well,
you're running for office now?
Yeah, I'm running for school board.
Great.
So I'm trying to take the approach Heiss said, which is try and win at the local level and control the feds there, as opposed to let's go to state or federal, because that costs a lot more fake Federal Reserve notes. That being said, I'm interested to hear your take, particularly on maybe a couple of things, because one, I'm not saying I know this is going to sound crazy. And when you were on Tim Pool, I was like the one guy rooting for you. I'm like, the Abraham Accords did nothing. But I'm not saying he's a good person. I'm not saying like, man, I think he's a terrible person. I think he's a horrible person. But what China did with Iran and Saudi Arabia, to me, actually is significant in the peace deal. I don't like BRICS. I'm an ANCAP. I'm friends with all my friends, even my anarchist friends. I'm trying to say, like, be more anarchist. My classical liberal friends, I get in arguments with, like, I think even that's too much. It's a very weird feeling for me because I have friends in Egypt now. My family's from Egypt, and they're like, hey, Egypt being in BRICS is a good thing, Kareem. Stop getting mad over this. I don't like BRICS as a global institution, but I like the peace deals that they're doing now. And I was very interested. I'm like, and once that happened, I saw that Iran and Saudi Arabia getting along. I'm like, I wonder what Scott Horton thinks of this, that China set this up. Xi Jinping, even not saying he's a good
come home, America, man. We don't have any need to be over there at all. Donald Trump said correctly that why are we securing Middle East oil when it's China that's consuming that oil, not America?
Yeah.
You know, we get to lord it over our allies, Korea and Japan, that we could cut them off too. Well, what kind of friend is that has to dominate Middle Eastern oil to threaten their allies and friends? That you better do what we say or else we'll starve you. And we should just call it all off. And if the Chinese want to back Israel, they can have them. They want Saudi Arabia, they can have them. America, I really mean this. There's just no reason whatsoever why we need to have an international U.S. government, right? We can have free trade with the world and open relationships with the world with a tiny little government that doesn't go anywhere or do anything at all. We don't need a State Department at all. Mm-hmm. You know, we don't have to do any of this crap, and we don't need even a standing army. Ron Paul said it, and it's kind of funny, but it's just true. We could defend this country with a couple of good submarines.
We could.
Anybody tries to come and invade our shores, yeah, right. No one's even going to try that. But if they tried that, they wouldn't get past one sub. One sub could defend each coast. And if it comes to thermonuclear war, one Trident submarine can kill all of Europe. Mm-hmm. One Trident submarine can kill all of China, all of Russia. You understand that? There's enough multiple re-entry vehicle warheads on each one of those Polaris missiles that we could literally tell China, you guys better look out. We have one submarine and we will mess you up if you ever mess with us. And then that's it. And we could just be a normal country in a normal time. We could be a limited constitutional commercial republic, minding its own business, trying to perfect our Bill of Rights and trying to increase prosperity and freedom for all the people of our land and show the world by example how to be. And it's not utopian, you know, libertarian paradise. This is just the basic what we are all supposed to be doing. You can be a Republican or a Democrat. You have to agree with me. You know, this new book is called Provoked, but I almost want to call it, you got to admit. You got to admit. You know what? You don't have to be a libertarian. I'm a libertarian, but I didn't write that book for libertarians. Like, oh, this is our libertarian position on the war here, the libertarian position on the war there. The book's for everybody to understand. And if you read enough already, or you read the new one when it comes out, then you got to admit that at the very least, since the end of the Cold War, we've been doing what we should have been doing. We've been messing around in other people's countries.
We very much ruined the, I guess you could say, once unipolar world. Like, we had a chance. Like, if you look at the fall of the Soviet Union, you look at now, we had a chance to do exactly what you said. Lead by example. Work on domestic issues, maintain a fairly decent monetary policy, which we're obviously not there, and it's probably gotten substantially worse. Mm-hmm. But we had a chance to dominate the world, not through intervention, not through a very extravagant foreign policy, but to be a producer, to produce, to export goods, to work on relationships with other countries in a diplomatic way. And I think literally at every single turn you look at, on foreign policy, we ruined it. I mean, you were going into the whole Middle Eastern disasters. It's so insane to see at each single point how we messed up, how we funded one side that eventually was used against us. Then we eventually turned back and used that side against another side, which then was eventually used against the country that we were defending. It's so entangled. It's so incoherent. It's so confusing. And to think, this is what really blows me, to think that people on the policy point, to think of lawmakers, to think of, journalists and news reporters, that they would be so insane and duplicitous to go along with this plan of this foreign policy on the Democratic Party, the Republican Party as well. Obviously, in the Bush years, it was more conservative. To go along with this for so long. 20 years, and there's still neocons. There's still people trying to, I wouldn't say defend, because you cannot be a defender of the Iraq war. There is no way rationally, reasonably, coherently you can defend that war. You can defend Afghanistan. You can defend Somalia, Sudan, Syria, all those other countries, Libya, where there's literal slave trade markets now because of what we did and what Hillary Clinton did. And I guarantee it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. How were so many people for so long able to go along with this? Were they just brainwashed? Were they propagandized? Why were so many people so unwilling to question the status quo? Why was it the Ron Paul and the very few minority of people who spoke out against this?
Look, the dominant culture is tied to the state, right? So like if you go back to like the W. Bush years, where the conservatives are the dominant culture. And so, like the South Park episode about Iraq War II wasn't even about Saddam Hussein. And he was a regular recurring character on South Park around that time. But Hussein wasn't even in it. The fight was country or rock and roll. And if you like country music, you support the war and you believe that Saddam Hussein did 9/11 and you got to go protect freedom. And if you like rock and roll, then you're anti-war. And, you obviously know that Saddam didn't do 9/11 stupid and whatever. And it's basically just whose side are you on in the dominant culture. And then so there's always going to be, there's Bruce Springsteen, right? And then there's Poison Idea, right? There's like the MTV, like the dominant what we're all listening to. And then there's like these weirdos over there who are listening to this completely different music, right? So essentially the war party, they control, the top 40. That's the dominant culture. And so the people who know better are always kind of the small, or if they're large, they're the unorganized opposition. And a lot of it is partisan politics, as much as anything else. If W. Bush is not a good Republican, he's sure a hell of a lot better than John Kerry or Hillary Clinton, isn't he? So whose side are you on, man? You can't be for them. They're even worse. And, the same thing here with, Joe Biden, where there are plenty of things about his government, and not least of which the war in Ukraine, for example, for leftists to rebel against and be upset about. But at the same time, man, you don't really want to rock the boat and undermine support for him in the face of Donald Trump and the Republican right as it exists now, who could win the next election if we undermine our guy here and this kind of thing. So people fall in line, man. They click their heels and they choose their team. And after all, it's complicated. So
yeah,
who do you trust? You know what I mean? Who do you believe? And these people are saying that we got to do this. I've told this story a lot of times, but I guess because I find it meaningful still. In 2003, right before the war, I guess it could have been late 2002, but I bet it was early 2003. I had a guy in my cab who was a real estate guy. And he was like tall and handsome, and he lived at these, you could tell he was like a rich guy, drove a sports car and had nice clothes, lived at like the swankiest bachelor pad apartments in South Austin, with a nice view and all this kind of thing. And we just had this great argument about the war. And he was just sure that Iraq had done 9/11. Iraq is a terrible threat, and we have to stop them. And I remember he said exactly to me, come on, if Iraq didn't do 9/11, then why would we be attacking them then?
Ooh.
Right. And so in other words, he just trusted and believed. I mean, it does sound, and this is what they do now. And if you say you don't believe in Russiagate, they go, oh, so in other words, you're a conspiracy theorist.
Or pro-Putin.
Yeah, you believe that these guys all joined in a conspiracy to lie. That's a crazy thing. If they're all saying this Russia thing, which of course the Russiagate was the conspiracy theory, right? But you're the conspiracy theorist for not believing in it, because that would require a conspiracy of men lying to you to try to make you believe that this conspiracy theory is true. This is the same kind of thing here. You're telling me, really, cab driver who smells like Mexican dirtweed and is listening to Public Enemy, you're telling me that you know that George Bush and Condoleezza Rice and Colin freaking Powell and Dick Cheney and all of these most responsible stewards of the American Republic are just lying to me outright and exploiting my fear and doing a bait and switch and tricking me into supporting a war into an extra country that didn't actually do anything? Well, that's bullshit, dude. That's crazy. And you're a Republican voter and you voted for these guys. And a guy like me is telling you that, like, nah, dude, you're getting jerned, buddy. They're jerking your chain, fool. Then no, you don't want to hear that. And this guy, all of his friends are doctors and dentists and lawyers and business owners, ministers of the church, right? This is a man about town. And all of them know that this is legit. All of them agree. And so, but I'm a cab driver, so I'm just driving drunks around all night. And they all know better. All the bartenders know better. All the other cab drivers know better. All the all the Tuesday night professional drunks, they all know better. And they can tell you in detail. They can go, look, man, Dick Cheney bought this company that was about to get busted on a bunch of asbestos cancer claim. Like, you can learn that from some scumbag in the middle of the night. You can't learn that reading the Wall Street Journal. Well, you can, but you wouldn't remember it. You're not going to get that narrative reading the Journal, you know? So it's a matter of consensus, right? And it's the same kind of thing going on with the war in Ukraine now. It's a pretty easy narrative. Russia is the bigger, more powerful country. As Kamala Harris said, Russia is a big country. They invaded Ukraine, which is a smaller country. Well, yeah, that is true. Russia is much more.
Wow, her dude, she's a foreign policy master, right there.
I'm impressed.
Right. Well, look, she said all you need to know right there. Basically,
she did say that.
We're on the side of the poor little guy who's getting picked on by the big guy. Now, in fact, you could zoom that narrative in a little bit, and you can see where actually America is backing the bully in Ukraine who's picking on the little guy in the Donbass, and the Russians are the big anti-bully who are coming to protect their little brother who's getting picked on. Might be a better analogy. Who's appeasing who, right? You're supposed to just pick America's side no matter what if you're here. And the reality is that Bill Clinton and W. Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump and Joe Biden, they're not America. They're just the presidents we've been saddled with. And their teams of war hawks are just the people who happen to have achieved the most power in our society. Unless you truly believe in like a fourth grade version of democracy where every public official is somehow expressing the will of the people doing their very best to try and decide and do the right thing. Otherwise, we're talking about where Lockheed and Raytheon and Israel agree what we should do, right? These power factions have decided to do a thing. W. Bush said, all this stuff about spreading democracy and remaking the thing, and, which is my real motive here. It's really hard to explain to the boys at the bar in Lubbock. I need to be able to explain this thing in terms that the boys at the bar in Lubbock can understand. Iraq is a threat. Iraq is a danger. Iraq is conventional.
Was that when he said it's we against, it's us against them? I think it was Bush who said that, right? Or was that Cheney? It's us against them.
Either with us or
he did say it's us versus the terrorists.
Yeah, there you go.
And the whole world has to choose which side you're on. Nobody's allowed to be neutral in this thing. You're either with us on the terror war or you're our enemy, was, what he was saying with that. But so, I mean, that's the thing is, look, it's just public relations, man. Karl Rove and his group, they created a thing called the White House Iraq Group, WIG. And their job was coming up with bullshit to scare your mama. That's all it was. Same thing with Douglas Feith and the guys at the Office of Special Plans at the Pentagon. It was like a focus group, A-B thing. What's scarier to the average housewife out there, germ weapons or chemical weapons. And what's scarier, sarin or mustard? Well, you might think sarin, but fewer of them have ever heard of sarin. But mustard gas, that sounds scary. They've heard of that, and they remember thinking, wow, you can turn good old mustard into a weapon? That's strange, because we like mustard, you know, like we all learn about that when we're little kids. Like, there's a weapon that you make out of hot dog sauce? What the fuck?
And one of the scarier things regarding that is how much of what these think tanks, these focus groups that you're talking about, were simply feeding this not only to people in government, but the media was picking up on this as though it was journalism, as though it was fact.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, that was at the Office of Special Plans, they would write up all their so-called intelligence in talking point format, and they would send it to the White House or to the vice president's office, to stovepipe it straight up to the vice president's office, and then they'd send it out to the media. And in fact, I have in the book where, was it the Rendon Group? No, it was the Office of Special Plans themselves. It was the Office of Special Plans themselves had sent a memo where they congratulated themselves that they had put 800 stories in the news about Iraq weapons in 2002.
And how many of those do you think were untrue?
All of them.
Really?
100% of them were lies. There were no weapons. Iraq had no weapons. They had been completely disarmed in 1991.
One of the things...
Weren't there weapons sales? I'm not saying they didn't have weapons. I'm saying if they did, as Bill Hicks would say, well, how do you know Iraq had weapons? We saw the receipt.
We looked at the receipt. Yeah. Well, and, you know, so Bill told that joke in 92, right? He told that joke about Iraq War I. Like, Iraq, incredible weapons. We looked at the receipt. What time's the bank open? 8? We're going in at 9, right? But the thing is, after that, America occupied the place. And after that, America and the United Nations weapons inspectors had the run of the place. And it's true that Iraq tried to hide some mustard gas in 1991, and they got caught in 1991, and they destroyed every last bit of it by the end of 1991. And the inspectors had gone everywhere and were completely satisfied of that fact by 1995. And then Saddam Hussein's son-in-law, Hussein Kamel, defected to Jordan and brought all of his documents with him and spilled his entire guts to the CIA, the MI6, the IAEA, and CNN. And you can go right now and find the transcript of Hussein Kamel on CNN. I watched it live when they interviewed Saddam Hussein's son-in-law. And he's going, look, man, I personally oversaw the destruction of every last bit of it. There is nothing. I got rid of it all. You can end the inspection regime. It's cool. And then he went home and Saddam killed him. But what Saddam also did was he panicked because he didn't know what his son-in-law had given up. So he ordered his people to write up this 12,000-page dossier and to go through every last nook and cranny and make sure every last thing was delivered over to the UN so they couldn't accuse him of cheating. That he would essentially give them whatever Hussein Kamel could have possibly gotten a copy of and given them, he would give them all of that same stuff too, so that they wouldn't be able to say, aha, why is page 113 missing? It's because it's not missing. It's right there, damn it. And then in 2002, Hussein gave essentially the same dossier to the UN. And Colin Powell goes, well, there's nothing new in here. Yeah, that's because they haven't made any more chemical weapons since then.
But right? Scott, don't you know, the random lady showed up and said, oh, they're taking babies out of incubators.
Oh, yeah. That was Iraq 1. That was one.
And look, in 1997, they were prepared to certify Iraq weapons of mass destruction free. And then Rolf Alqaedas of the UN inspection regime. And then Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, gave a speech where, in fact, you could watch the speech online, or you could as of a few years ago. I have the footnote in there in Fool's Errand, where she announces that no matter what, the sanctions regime stays until Saddam Hussein is gone.
500,000 people died as a result.
Well, it wasn't. Actually, that's not right. It was 300,000, which is a lot.
300,000. Okay.
Yeah, that was the one report that said 5 was an exaggeration. Okay, but still, it was.
300K is still a lot.
And look, this is what caused, more than any other thing, this was the motive for the September 11th attack. For Al-Qaeda to turn against the United States was the permanent blockade and no-fly zone bombing regime against Iraq waged from bases in Saudi Arabia. as well as support for Israel. And that was why, again, the Cobar Towers attack killed 19 American airmen. And the message should have been loud and clear that, look, there are these radical right-wing religious forces in Saudi Arabia who will not tolerate the presence of white Christian American combat forces stationed on their land to wage this endless aggression against civilians in the country next door. And which, after all, they could have just bombed them from carriers in the Gulf, you know? But they weren't content to do that. They, you know, I guess it's maybe it was a battle between the Air Force and the Navy, that if you guys get to bomb them, we get to bomb them too, you know? And so, but this is why they attacked us and knocked our towers down. More than any other thing was, you know, those bases. And again, see, we told the story all out of order. People just got to read enough already. We told the story out of order tonight, but, you know, this was, the no-fly zone bombing, no-fly zone was created in the aftermath of the Shiite uprising that we talked about earlier, when Bush Sr. had encouraged the uprising and then stabbed them in the back, and Saddam Hussein crushed them. Then that became the excuse to stay. Now we have to keep our troops in Saudi, our bases in Saudi, to contain Saddam and to protect the Shiites and the Kurds from his aggression, which he'd already put down the insurrection. It's not like he was just going to keep killing them forever, but that was the excuse. You know,
one thing, Scott, I'm actually a little bit surprised at one thing you said, or maybe even debate it, because I know his three reasons, and one was troops in Saudi Arabia, which I don't think that was the main force. But I think the one thing I talked to, like, you talk to all Muslim or Arab people and white people in Egypt, they will bring. I'm not saying it's a tragedy. Madeleine Albright's a psychopath and she's in a terrible place, but you bring up like Iraq, you know, this, the biggest thing, and they still go to, and I can see my family posts about every day is Palestine. Like, that's all they,
sure.
Like, it's Palestine, like, just leave Palestine alone.
And Lebanon.
Yeah. So I am actually surprised. I thought Palestine was the main driving force between.
I would say that's two. So if you go look, the best source on this is the book Imperial Hubris by Michael Scheuer, and he's really gone crazy now, but he was a much more reasonable character in the Bush years, and this book is fantastic. He's the former chief of the CIA's Bin Laden unit, and he he ticks off the reasons in essentially the order of most mentioned by Osama, and that was the troops, the bases in Saudi Arabia, which were being used to bomb Iraq. Support for Israel in Palestine and in Lebanon, and then back to Saudi and the Gulf, is support for all the regional dictators, pressure on them to keep their oil prices artificially low, to subsidize our economy at their expense, and then turning a blind eye toward Russia, China, India, and Kazakhstan for their oppression of Muslims. And so, you know, you claim you're all about human rights, but when it's Muslims being oppressed, you don't do anything, which is funny because, as we already stipulated, Bill Clinton backed them in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Chechnya against the Russians. Yeah. So that was it. And look, you mentioned earlier the declarations of war from 1996, and then there was a second one in 1998. The one in 1996 is called the Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places. That's the title of the thing. The one from 98 is called Declaration of War Against the Jews and Crusaders. But in the 1996 one, a huge part of it is about Operation Grapes of Wrath, which after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres became prime minister of Israel. And in order to prove what a tough guy he was, he attacked southern Lebanon. And as soon as he did, as soon as it began, Mohammed Atta and Ramzi bin al-Shid, this is the lead hijacker and his best friend, these are Egyptian students studying in Hamburg, Germany. They declared, wrote out their last will and testament, and essentially joined the army, declared their loyalty, and I guess decided they were, one way or the other, they were going to fight the United States. I'm not sure if they were determined to join Al-Qaeda at that point, but then just a couple of months later, bin Laden put out his declaration of war. And in there, he talked about Grapes of Wrath, and he talked about what's now called the first Qana massacre, because the Israelis did it again 10 years later in 2006. But they bombed a UN shelter full of women and children, killed 106 women and children. And bin
Israel
Laden,
did.
I'm sorry?
Israel did.
Yes.
Okay, just make
Bin
sure.
Laden went on about this at length, and he often did during that time, but especially in that declaration of war. And he says, we'll never forget the severed arms and heads of the children there. Right. And these are real pictures of real severed arms and heads of children. Right. And he says, this may have been in a later speech. He says, you think that your blood is blood, but our blood is just water. Well, we're going to show you. Right. So this was absolutely, in response to what Israel was doing to the Palestinians and to the Lebanese at that time. And then when Mohammed Atta and Ramzi bin al-Shibh read that, they said, that's it, let's do this. And they went and traveled to Afghanistan and joined Al-Qaeda.
They were the lead attackers, correct?
This is the guy that crashed into the North Tower, man.
Yeah. So where do you think we go from here?
In Guantanamo right now. Bin al-Shibh is in Guantanamo right now.
And actually,
Mohammed, yeah.
Did you, because I know I asked you before, and I was like, I'll even debate Scott on this. Do you think there's still a chance for Palestine to exist in some form? Or I think you said it was. But no.
Well, that's a good question. No, I don't. I think, well, in some form, yeah, but I think the obvious form for the future of Palestine is a binational state. Or essentially just a one-state solution, right? There is one sovereign government. Maybe there are two administrations for, Palestinians deal with the Palestinians, but, you have multinational states around the world from time to time, and it could work. I mean, I think.
Because the issue I have is I'll talk to some people who are like, not Likud. They're not extreme. They're not super liberal. I don't know exactly what you'd call them, but they're not necessarily Zionist, but they're kind of moderate, and they'll say, well, Kareem, we don't agree with Netanyahu's party. I'm like, okay, good. But there are Palestinians in the Knesset, so you're good. Like, why are you still upset? And I'm like, well, because, you're keeping, I don't have any problem with any ethnicity, but you're keeping a certain group of people in a trapped air prison, and then
look, it's just a basic misunderstanding of the situation, right? You have approximately 20% of the citizens of Israel are Palestinian Muslims and Christians, almost all Muslims, but some Christians, I guess. But then you also have another 6 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza Strip and in various refugee camps around the region who have no rights whatsoever, no political representation whatsoever.
Really?
And the last government was the first government in the history of Israel that ever included the Arabs in the ruling coalition at all. So they can sit like ornaments in the Knesset. They don't have any power whatsoever. And of course, the people in the West Bank and Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem essentially had no representation whatsoever, no political representation, no civil liberties, no civil rights, no right to participate in the foreign occupation military government that rules over them. So it's like saying, the Indians who live in Phoenix are treated okay, but the ones out on the reservation outside of town, we bomb them all the damn time, and they can just lay down and die if they don't like it. That's what we're talking about, Yeah.
So because I was kind of curious to ask you, like, what's ironic is I realize I'm an anarchist and I'm asking for a two-state solution. I think probably just dissolve the Knesset and just go back to, I don't know, some kind of we have the Kabbalists here and everything. Because my understanding, and my dad tells me this, I wasn't born at the time, is before Zionism, everything was pretty good. Like, everybody got along relative. I'm not saying there's no problems, but everybody got along.
Look, I agree with you, man. I think, first of all, it's too late for a two-state solution. You can't. There's too many Israeli Jewish settlers who have already seized control of the West Bank. And it would be a civil war within Israel for the army to try to get them out of there. And there's no political will for it. It's just never going to happen. It's just too late. The facts on the ground are facts. And this is why B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and now, Foreign Affairs Journal, I talked with Phil Weiss about this today. In Foreign Affairs, they've written or published a couple of very important pieces now saying it's time for us to recognize the illusion of the two-state solution is over. So for people who don't understand, I know it's a complicated thing, but essentially half the population of Israel are occupied by the other half and have no rights. It's like Mississippi in the 1930s or something. And so, and they're, under military occupation. I mean, actually, that's really, it's a sort of close comparison a little bit, but the blacks and whites of Mississippi in the 30s were all Americans. This is different. This is really, more like the whites versus the Indians compared to like whites versus blacks in America, if that makes sense. But anyway, the deal is that in the 60s, in 47, 48, they took control of a huge part of the land and cleansed 750,000 people off of their land. And the West Bank was left under the control of the Jordanians and the Gaza Strip under the control of the Egyptians. And then in 67, the Israelis beat Syria, Egypt, and Jordan in the war, and they seized the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And man, they want that West Bank. To them, to the right-wing religious Israelis at least, this is Judea and Sumeria, and the Bible says it belongs to them. Screw your natural rights. Our supernatural rights say we can kick you off of this land and keep all of it for ourselves.
Which is weird to me because they don't specify, like the Bible looked at the passage and they say the Golan Heights and this, and I'm like, okay, but there's no specific locate, like they act like it's a Google Maps thing, like, oh well, God.
I think they say that God promised Abraham all that he can see from the top of the highest hill or whatever. So that whatever. It's all bullshit anyway. What are you gonna do?
What does that mean?
But so that means though that what happened was Israel took possession of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and they did cleanse another 250,000 people from their homes, but they essentially kidnapped millions of people. They weren't able to cleanse them all off of the land the way that they had done in 47 and 48. So now by seizing the territory, they also seized all of these people, and then they don't know what to do with them all. So what had happened was the Western powers insisted, first at Camp David in 79, which they just outright broke this promise and lied and never even tried to implement it at all through the 80s. But then was the Oslo Accords that came in early Clinton years, first Madrid under Bush Sr. and then Oslo. And this was the so-called peace process, as you guys have heard of it, where supposedly someday they're going to work this out and there's going to be a Palestinian state. The West Bank and Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem will be a separate state next to Israel. And so therefore now we don't have to, the Israeli government does not have to give them equal rights because we're going to give them independence one day. So instead of giving them equal rights, we're going to give them independence. Just hold your horses. It's coming any day now, but then it never came. And now it's 30 years later and they never got their two-state solution. And this whole time, the Israelis have been colonizing, especially the West Bank. They want that much more than Gaza, East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And this has been compared to negotiating over a pizza while one side is eating it, right? So, but here's the thing. Now the Israelis have taken so much of the West Bank that outright declared, essentially Netanyahu declared the last time he was prime minister, that there will only ever be one security force that dominates all of the land from the river to the sea. So instead of saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, he's saying from the river to the sea, Israel will have control over everyone, including the Palestinians who are going to stay rightsless helots on occupied land under not just martial law, but under a foreign government's military occupation law. And that was when B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty threw up their hands and said, well, look, we can no longer pretend that someday is going to come. Netanyahu is no longer pretending that someday is going to come. A two-state solution is an illusion. It's now an admitted one. It's now a canceled one. Now it's not even an illusion. Now it's an expired illusion. So now what the hell are we going to do? Now we have to face the fact it is one state. So now what? And what's funny is, to me, the obvious thing is for every Palestinian to just demand Israeli citizenship immediately, right? And put them on their moral back foot there, that now it's like Mississippi analogy. Now it's the blacks of the old South demanding equal civil rights under the same ruling regime that the whites that they live under have.
Would that work? Because here's the issue I have. Even if you say, well, the hard part is, from my understanding, I'm not a foreign policy expert or anything. I just run around and you know, put up signs and talk to people about like taxation and stuff. But my understanding is you have to be Jewish, first of all, to be an Israeli citizen, which I don't think.
Well, that's the point. That's the point, right? Is they need to demand Israeli citizenship, and they're just going to have to admit and drop the character. Israel can either be a Jewish state or it can be a democracy. It cannot be a Jewish democracy while they hold 6 million people in slavery. It just is not working. And again, they were able to get away with this as long as they were promising that someday there will be independence. Now that that promise is off, that pretended promise is off, it's got to come to a head. And now look, I talked to Palestinians about this and they go, well, we hate your stupid idea too. We don't want to be citizens of Israel. We want to be citizens of Palestine. Or we want to be citizens of a new state with a new constitution where we're all equal together, whatever. And I'm like, well, man, what the hell? You got to start somewhere. And I think by all of them demanding Israeli citizenship, it makes clear to, for example, the American people who don't understand really that they are already under the control of Israel, right? You might think from watching American TV that Palestine already is the country next door. There already has been a two-state solution. They are a second state, and they won't leave the poor Israelis alone, right? But if they're instead saying, no, we are under the control of the government in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, they rule us, and so we want full citizenship and full representation. I think from a public relations point of view, that's their best bet. But every Palestinian that I've mentioned that to says that I'm stupid and wrong and that'll never work and they should do it their way instead. But, you know, and look, it ain't like, oh, and back to what you were saying, this is the point I wanted to get to, was about people getting along there. There's this mythology that if the Palestinians have their way, they're going to murder every last Israeli Jew. They're going to push them all into the sea. Well, look, it actually turns out, I need to memorize the guy's name so I can tell the story better, but it actually turns out that phrase, that push all the Jews into the sea, was actually coined by a Mossad agent, an undercover. You're right. It was an undercover false flag.
So it wasn't even a Palestinian who said it.
Yeah, it's like Ahmadinejad. Oh, he wants to go
insane. That sounds like some FBI, CIA type stuff.
Had been turned by Mossad. So even that phrase, that threatening phrase, was a false flag attack in the damn first place. The Palestinians never said that. And when I talk to Palestinians about this, they tell me, and honestly, guys, you look at what the Palestinians say about this. They don't say that, oh man, you know, once they tear this fence down, boy, are we going to cut all y'all's throats and all that. They don't say that. They say, we want equal rights. They don't say, you have to leave. They say,
well, how can they say that? Yeah, how can they say that in the first place? How can they say that in the first place if they don't? They're not even a state. They're not even a mini state. They're people occupied who are being occupied by another state. So I will agree 100% that the way the media frames it is that that there's some equivalency between Palestine and between Israel, as though they're somehow on an equal or maybe a little lopsided playing ground, when one is literally at the very, very bottom, not asking for their own state per se, although obviously, like you mentioned, the two-state solution has been the cause for a long time, but they're simply asking for rights, basic rights. I mean, why do you think it is, Scott, and I guess Kareem as well, why do you think it is that the media has framed this so much on Israel's side? I have not seen very little media coverage basically explaining what you explained.
Zionists control it, man.
Zionists control. That's right. He's going to say the exact thing. And,
look, I mean, I'll tell you, there was one time ever that cable TV news showed a map and said, here's who's occupying who. And it was at the very end of Barack Obama when he abstained. He wasn't man enough to vote for it, but he abstained when the UN Security Council voted for this resolution telling the Israelis to get out of the West Bank. And it was really controversial. And so they had a couple of guys on MSNBC put up a map and go, okay, look, here are the Jewish-only roads, and here are the walls around the imprisoned people, and here's all the settlements dividing up their land and all of these things. And it was good, but it was just once. Only once ever in December of 2016, never before and never again. I mean, if there was a before, maybe it was Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes in the 1970s or something. But they will never show you Here's a map of Israel. Here's the West Bank. Here's Gaza. Here's who's who, and here's what's happening. Because if they do that, the game is up. If they do that, then you get to understand who has the power and who's occupying who. But they've actually been quite successful in making people believe that it's the Palestinians who are occupying the poor Israelis.
Yes,
that's the issue.
I must admit that I honestly fell for it to some degree, because I would see in the New York Times, I'd see in the AP News, I would see in many sources, even sources like the New York Post and the Daily Mail, and sources I usually typically trust, not 100% obviously, and almost every single one of them, and of course the cable news network, CNN, MSNBC, NBC, and even Fox News, they're so heavily on the side of Israel. I was under the assumption that Israel, okay, that there was obviously some differences, the difference in religion, difference in territory. Kareem, you brought it up that Israel basically claims the land was theirs first and stuff like that. But I was under the assumption that Palestine was some sort of a state fighting with another state to maybe gain power. And Palestine was somehow, the way they made it seem to me is that Palestine wasn't innocent in the thing, that they were basically contributing to some of the violence that Israel would give to them. But it is fair to say that the violence has been mainly lopsided, correct? Is that an understatement?
Yeah, to me, it's like a, MMA expert fighting a toddler, and you're like, oh, the toddler kind of pushed me. And they threw a sparkler at me, so I just had to defend myself.
Look, you know what it is? It's like this. I actually saw on Twitter, somebody said once, has anyone ever been convinced of any political truth by an analogy? And someone responded and said, yes, Scott Horton convinced me. I understood Israel-Palestine because Horton made the analogy that the Palestinians are not Mexico across the border. They are Indians on a reservation.
That's
they've already been conquered. So when
how can they even fight back if they don't even have their own security force like Israel? Like Israel, it's fair to say they have basically a monopoly on force, correct?
Well, they have trustees in an Israeli prison, right? So there's the Palestinian Authority was trained up and armed up by America and Israel to rule over the people of the West Bank. And Hamas rules the people of the Gaza Strip. But of course, they're more independent than the Palestinian Authority, but ultimately they are trustees in an Israeli open-air concentration camp. They're nothing like a sovereign government over an independent state at all.
So you're saying that they would even in some cases take orders / defend Israel?
Well, I don't know, defend Israel, but
they're at their behest.
Yes, so for example, if Islamic Jihad was going to go crazy and start a war with Israel, Hamas would stop them from doing that, right?
So real quick, because I want to get
guys, there have been times in Gaza where a couple of Al-Qaeda guys stick their heads up, and then Hamas comes down like a ton of bricks.
That's interesting. See, I didn't even hear that. So just to give some perspective to myself and to the audience, how big is the West Bank? How big is the area, just roughly speaking, which Palestine, I guess, has some control over, but like you said, control within another state that ultimately controls it? Like, how big are we talking?
I don't know the square miles, honestly. Yeah, I know it's the West Bank and Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem combined are 22% of what's left of Palestine, historic Palestine. So if they got, when Arafat recognized Israel in 1988, he was saying, you guys keep 88% and leave us 22. And what the Israeli government has said ever since then is, nope, screw you, not good enough. We want all of it.
Yeah, which to me,
and we've correct. It's correct in saying that we've been supporting Israel in essentially this 100%. And have we at all supported Palestine in any way?
Well, you could say that Jimmy Carter tried to get a 2-state deal, and Bill Clinton tried to get a 2-state deal, and they would only ever go so far in pushing for that. But the official position of the State Department is, in fact, the U.S. voted for the UN Security Council resolution back in 1968, I guess, that said that the Israelis have to leave the West Bank, the occupied territories.
That's right.
And the Israelis go, nuh-uh, because in the French version, it makes it sound more like occupied territories, whereas in the English version it says the occupied territories, where we know which ones you're talking about.
Wow.
The French
So
version,
they interpreted it. They interpreted from the French version, which gave essentially a different conclusion, and then basically said, "Okay,
well, they
we'll
lie about that."
Okay, they lie about that.
To believe that, in other words, you know.
I see what you're saying, and they also, from what it sounds like, what they did was, we're going to do this. This is the deal. Let's do it. But we're not going to do it right this second, basically prolonging it forever without ever having to do it. Like there was no sort of time frame. There was no actual deal set in place to actually make the action. It was basically, hey, like you said, the Minsk Accords, right? They had no plan in actually going along with it. They were just doing it to build up arms. I know it's not the same exact situation, but similar to that.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. They never meant it. It was all a scam. And look, so that means that Ben Shapiro is a goddamned liar when he tells people what's going on here. This
You're gonna get me in trouble. No, I'm just kidding.
This would be like if the Mexicans were shooting rockets over the Rio Grande at Texas.
Yeah, he said
that. What do you expect us to do? Not defend ourselves? But he's lying, and he knows he's lying, and he assumes that all of his audience are idiots, and he doesn't respect them at all, obviously, because he lies right to their damn face. This is not like Mexico attacking over the Rio Grande. This is like the Navajo attacking over the wall of their ghetto concentration camp Indian reservation, where they've already been completely conquered and surrounded by overwhelming force. This is like an uprising at Attica prison in New York.
That's a good example. That's a good example.
It's not Mexico attacking across a sovereign border. That guy Shapiro is a liar.
Yeah, He's
is lying. And look, why do the Israelis lie? Because they're in the wrong. They have to lie.
Do you think that, so you're saying they knowingly, here's what I'm saying. Do they knowingly, like, or do they say, okay, we basically control Gaza, or is it one of those things like with the Iraq war that they're being lied into it? Like, how do you think Ben Shapiro has looked at the actual data and look? I mean, he's a pretty smart guy.
Ben Shapiro is a liar. Okay. All the Kudniks are liars.
I would say so too, especially with him, because he's too smart and has too many freaking sources to not know the data.
He doesn't think that Gaza controls a sovereign, independent state in the Gaza Strip. He knows good and damn well that's still occupied territory. They've been under total siege since 2007. They're not allowed to have an airport. They're not allowed to have a seaport. Every bit of trade that goes in and out of there is under Israeli control. It's a complete joke. No, the Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and Bet Salem call it an apartheid state. But for no reason at all.
We're apartheid in the sense that it's Israel v. Palestine or Palestine v. Israel? Like
no, apartheid is in apartheid South Africa, where 10% of whites rule the rest under a totalitarian dictatorship.
They're saying that Palestine does that towards Israel.
No. I'm saying Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and Bet Salem all call Israel an apartheid state. But Ben Shapiro and the would have you believe that's for no reason at all. And there's no apartheid-like qualities here. This is a contest between sovereigns. When no, it's goddamned not. That's like saying, you know, the government of Mississippi going to war against blacks in the 1930s.
Yeah,
the blacks are like the sovereign nation of northern black Alabama and Mississippi that attacked the poor, innocent white ruling regime that now has to defend itself. Doesn't that sound like a bunch of bullshit to you?
It absolutely is. And from point A, they're at a disadvantage. The scale of power is so heavily in Israel's favor, it's not even funny. But I just looked it up. So it's 2,000 square miles. That is not that much. I want to read this real quick because it says something interesting. It says the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, has a land area of 5,000 kilometers plus a water area of 220 kilometers, consisting of the northwest quarter of the Dead Sea. It has an estimated population of 2.7 million Palestinians, and over 670,000 Israeli settlers live in the West Bank, of which approximately 220,000 live in East Jerusalem. The international community considers Israel's settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem to be illegal under international law, though Israel disputes it. A 2004 advisory ruling by the International Court of Justice concluded that events that came after 1967 capture of the West Bank by Israel, including the Jerusalem Law and the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty, I don't know if that's the Oslo Accords, there you go, did not change the status of the West Bank and East Jerusalem as an Israeli-occupied territory. Alongside the self-governing Gaza Strip, the Israeli-occupied West Bank and the East Jerusalem are claimed by the state of Palestine. So even Wikipedia admits this. And granted, Wikipedia gets some stuff wrong. Like we were talking about Sudan. I would not be surprised if they had some corruption on there, especially because, you know, anyone can basically write in stuff. It's not like a credible source anymore. But even Wikipedia states it. How can you not know this if Wikipedia states it?
Yeah, look, and the 500,000 Israeli settlers on the West Bank, that's all a war crime. You can't do that. You can't.
Yeah, and they just said it. The international community ruled that they do not have any legal legal definition or constitutional basis to occupy the area, meaning it should still be Palestine. They still should not be occupying it, and they're still not out of there. At this point, again, I'm glad you came on and talked to me about this because I was unaware about a couple of those facts. I mean,
I'll tell you what, and read this book. It's called Coming to Palestine by Sheldon Richman. We published it at the Institute.
All right.
And, you know, he's our executive editor at the Institute. And it's called Coming to Palestine. It's a short book. It's a great little collection of essays explaining about the foundation of the Israeli state at the expense of the Palestinian people. I mean, you know, for people who are especially kind of new to this subject, you might ask yourself, why so many Israeli and American Jews take the side of the Palestinians?
Really?
You know, you hear the Irish going around siding with England, right? You know, why? In fact, you do hear the English explain the Irish side of the story from time to time. Why would so many American Jews side with the Palestinians against the Israeli state? And the answer is obvious. It's simple, and you can ask any of them, and they'll explain it to you. It's because what the government of Israel is doing is unjust. And they don't give a damn who's who. What's right is right, and what's wrong is wrong, and it's wrong to kidnap and steal and murder people. You can't do that. And the way that the Palestinians are being treated is absolutely horrible, and it's wrong. And so you have a huge controversy in, you know, American Jewish communities of all descriptions about, you know, America and their own support for the Israeli state. And in fact, a lot of the support for the two-state solution comes from liberal Zionists, and I mean liberal like in the worst way, like center-left Hillary Clinton type liberals.
Oh, not liberals, you mean?
Yeah, well, they are what they are, but they're center-left types, and they go, look, we want a two-state solution because we don't want all those damn N-words polluting our wonderful Jewish democracy.
No.
Right? So the Zionist dream necessitates that we, you know, jettison these Palestinians. And if that means we have to give up the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and let them have it, fine. It's better than having them inside Israel.
Here's a question, and then I'll move on to a different
center-left liberal Jewish Ku Klux Klan kind of point of view, if you understand.
Yeah, here's a question, and then I'll move on to the next thing, and then we can wrap it up. So what do you think, if you were to guess, what do you think the proportion of Palestinians who have been killed / persecuted or in prison are? Like, do you have any ideas of the numbers or anything like that?
I mean, I can tell you that if you count all of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, if you count the Palestinian residents of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, and you count the Palestinians languishing in the refugee camps in Syria, Tunisia, and Jordan, among others, and all of the expats in the United States and Europe, there are more Palestinians than Israeli Jews.
And you're saying in the whole area?
Yeah, I'm saying it's roughly 6 million each, with a small advantage for the Palestinians.
That's insane.
So it is literally a minority ruling the majority.
That's insane.
It is insane. It's completely wrong. And if it was going on anywhere else in the world, our American government would be screaming their heads off over it. If this was the Russians' project, or this was the Iranians' project, this would be the example of how they are the great Satan and why we are justified in doing whatever we want to them. You know, it is.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about, we talked about it before the podcast, but the current state of the conservative Republican Party, and where do you see the conservative party? This is one of my fears. Do you see the conservative party continuing down this road of anti-war, anti-interventionism? And again, I'm aware they're still neocons, but I'm saying, like we talked about, most conservatives I meet are not for foreign wars anymore. Most, by far the majority. Now, they still have other opinions like election fraud in 2020 and stuff like that I disagree with. But on foreign policy, they are where liberals were not that long ago. Like you said, the people who had the anti-Vietnam sentiments. Do you see the Republican Party taking power in 2024? And if so, do you think that there's another reversal? Do you think that just like now Biden's in, and you brought this up, Democrats are like, well, his administration is pretty authoritarian and not good. And like you brought up Ukraine war, but he's the guy, so you have to support him. Do you see that moving forward with the Republican Party? And
just what do you see? Bombing, man. Look, I mean, if Republicans can be extremely hawkish with the right leadership telling them to be. So like when Trump decided not to attack Iran, they went, yeah, see what a great leader he is? He decided not to attack Iran. But when he assassinated their top general, which could have led right to war with Iran, they went, yeah, that's right. That's what a real man does.
Yeah. What was the general's name? Again?
Soleimani.
Soleimani, that's right.
So now it's true that when he bombed Syria a couple of times over the fake sarin gas attacks in 2017 and 2018, that he didn't get much support from his people for that.
Yeah.
But then again, you know, if he was in there now and got into a fight with China, they absolutely would rally around that. You know,
I agree.
The Russians, the Russians, they're fine. It's the Chinese, they're the real enemy. Or, you know, Iraq, they're fine. It's Iran, they're the real problem. Or what you can, and I don't look. I don't want to, play down the progress that has been made. I guess. As David,
at least Trump did not start a new war. At least Trump did not start a new war. That is one good thing. I know he did other stuff.
Yeah,
I know it's a stupid argument, but that's something. That's better than Bush and Obama. Is all my point.
Look, and what's important is that that's the talking point, right? The talking point is not that, look, man, my Trump killed way more people than your Obama. The argument is that no, Obama was the reckless one, and Trump tried to do less. At least he didn't start a new war, even though he kept some going and that kind of thing. So that's what's important. That's the new invention of our era, is the right. I mean, after all, look, Donald Trump started denouncing the war in Afghanistan in 2013. And the thing is, he was right. Now, what a completely ridiculous and stupid waste of time and money and effort and young soldiers' blood, and never mind the poor people of Afghanistan, to try to do this. Now, any idiot could figure that out.
That's true.
But also, once any idiot does figure that out, well, they're really right. And how are you going to get them to change their mind about with Donald Trump that Afghanistan is a waste of time? But in 2021, I think he's right that we got to give it one more shot. No, the thing is stupid. And once you get that right, it's pretty hard to kind of take that back. Well, now look at what's happened. Anyone can look back the last 20 years and say, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia. What do we get for any of it? Nothing. We got
so many countries.
And $10 billion. We killed 2 million people. We destroyed the American Bill of Rights. We destroyed the American economy. We destabilized Europe and destabilized the United States and destabilized the entire goddamn Middle East. And what do we get out of it? Nothing. Unless you get dividend checks from Lockheed, you are on the shit end of this entire project. So it's hard for people to look at that and go, yeah, man, you know, let's follow our great leaders. They know what to do. You know, I mean, Donald Trump, the support for him is based on the fact that he, you know, represents that disgust and lack of confidence in the previous regime. But again, look, I mean, right-wingers ain't libertarians. And they can be real good on a lot of things, but, you know, you can turn it right around and go, you know, the problem with Joe Biden is he wasn't tough enough. In fact, Donald Trump talks like this. Donald Trump says, Vladimir Putin would never have invaded Ukraine on my watch because I would have threatened him more severely and he wouldn't have dared to cross me. right? Not because I'm such a great diplomat that we would have worked out an amicable solution for everybody and whatever. It's because I'm such a tough guy. So then you have, right-wing pro-Trump people who are against the war in Ukraine. Like, how did I take that? Well, I could say, geez, he sounds like a damn Democrat, and that bothers me. Or I could say, yeah, that's how Donald Trump would have prevented the war, by being so tough. And so you just see how that's, as the Jedi would say, a path to the dark side there. You're already compromising big time. And Ron Paul had an in-depth understanding and philosophy of non-interventionism. Donald Trump never did. Donald Trump just looked at Afghanistan and said, that's a waste of money. And he looked at Iraq and he said, we should steal the oil, and that would make it.
Yeah, he said that. Do you remember when he was getting ready to leave and they were asking him, hey, what about Syria? And he was like, don't worry, we'll protect the oil. We're going to protect the oil.
Yeah,
like right in front of you, right in front of you.
Mercantilist, right? So he's not a non-interventionist. He just thinks that, look, if we're going to invade a country and kill all the people, we ought to at least steal the resources, or else what are we doing? Because that's, and look, he's the same guy who says cops should just execute bad guys on the street because they're bad. And
also the same guy who said we should bomb the cartels.
And he sent weapons to Zelensky. And he sold.
He did do that, and he sent weapons to Saudi Arabia, and he sent money to Saudi Arabia, which was then used against the Yemen people, like we talked about the infrastructure.
Look,
and all
and
that.
you can tell a MAGA guy who goes, look, Donald Trump didn't start any new wars, and then you go, yeah, but he bombed Yemen for 4 years, and they'll go, yeah, but Yemen's friends with Iran.
Yeah, you're absolutely right,
and I go right back to George W. Bush years.
You're absolutely right.
That you made a change. You didn't make a change. Right,
yeah,
right back to whatever Dick Cheney would tell you to think.
And one of the things that gets me, and I bring that up sort of as a devil's advocate position, is because I see guys like Tim Pool, a lot of people who, I'm not going to say I hate them because I like them on certain things. I like the fact that they're covering news stories that are not being covered in the mainstream media. I like that mostly they're based on truth when they're covering reporting. But a lot of what these disaffected liberals and conservatives and MAGA people say is that, oh, no new wars. Oh, he was less imperial. But one of the things that gets me, and this is a real accomplishment, by accomplishment, I mean in a bad way, is that he ramped up the drone strikes. I don't know how you beat Obama's freaking accomplishments with drone strikes, because he was the king of droning people. He even to one of his staffers said that he's good at droning, and that was reported, I believe, the AP or the New York Times or something like that.
No, it was Obama himself said, turns out I'm really good at killing people.
Yeah, there you go. And he killed a American citizen in Yemen, Abdul Rahman Alaki, I think that was his name. Yeah. And Trump ramped up the drone strikes. Like what's crazy to me is this.
Well, only in Afghanistan. Well, no, and in Somalia as well. Somalia as well. But look, I mean, he doesn't beat Barack Obama on that. Barack Obama.
Okay. Maybe they're just lying then. That's what I saw in the reporting, that he ramped up the drone strikes more than Barack Obama, meaning that he did more drone strikes. I didn't think that was true.
Trump only bombed Pakistan once.
Yeah.
He did increase the air war in Afghanistan. He pretty much held steady in Yemen, which was not American drones. I mean, that was really, a Saudi UAE air war there. He inherited the last year of Iraq War III, and he did, order massive attacks on ISIS targets in Western Iraq and Eastern Syria. And he did escalate in Somalia as well. He devolved the authority to order strikes. Although, I think probably if you go back and count, I bet you on a 4 year by 4 year basis, I bet Barack Obama bombs.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And this is the article I'm citing here. Trump is using deadly drone strikes more than Obama ever did.
Who does that say it's by?
This is by Yahoo Finance, by someone named Ciro Scotti. I don't know him, or if you're familiar with him. Yeah. But it essentially says former President Obama wasn't shy about ordering drone strikes. Literally, like you just said, he literally bragged about it, including a notable one that killed a fiery American cleric in Yemen who was accused of fomenting jihadist attacks. But his successor is ramping up the use of unmanned autonomous vehicles to attack American enemies.
What year is that from? What's the date on that article?
This is 2017.
Yeah, that's bullshit. From what month?
This is 2017 in April.
Yes,
I don't know how that's possible. I don't know how that's possible though, because
for 3 months.
Yeah, I know.
This
That doesn't
guy's
make
saying
any
more
sense.
than Obama ever did. That's a ridiculous lie. And
There
what
you
he
go.
did was he devolved command authority down so that local captains in the field can call in a drone strike without calling 15 lawyers first and whatever. And he did reduce the restrictions on the authority to order strikes. But that doesn't equate to a larger quantity of strikes compared to Barack Obama's drone wars in Yemen and in Pakistan. And this is when Trump is in power for 3 months. So that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, that doesn't mean anything. I agree with you.
Also, I can't remember what the bill is or what the thing is, but he got rid of the record keeping. So it's like, did you drop a drone here? It's like,
I think you're right.
I don't know. I don't know what I did.
I want to read this because I think it's going to what you're saying, Scott. According to a 2018 report in the Daily Beast, which again, I do not find a credible news organization whatsoever, Obama launched 186 drone strikes in Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan during his first 2 years in office. And Trump's first 2 years, he launched 238. The Trump administration has carried out 176 strikes in Yemen in just 2 years. So I don't know if it's saying
how's it 2 years if the article's from 2017?
This one is a different one. This one is from 2019.
Okay. Well, if
regardless, they're both bad. I don't know. It just seemed a little absurd to me when I saw it too, given how much longer Obama was in office. But I don't know.
Well, I'd have to look at the airwars.com or other guys or airwars.org. Chris Woods. That's where you can find the total count. Okay. And they have a count of every single strike. So I'd have to look at that. But I know he massively escalated the air war in Afghanistan, and he did devolve command authority down, loosen command authority for strikes in Somalia. And I know he did strikes in Somalia from time to time, but Barack Obama absolutely bombed the hell out of Somalia, including used, shot cruise missiles from submarines. So you're talking, a $10 billion submarine firing a $5 million missile to blow up a thatched hut to kill a woman and her daughter. That was Barack Obama's war in Somalia. So it could be that Trump did worse than that.
Also, Scott, one of the things you bring up, yes, he used more drone strikes in his first 2 years of office, and maybe drones just particular, but Obama, they're just classifying as drones. You know what I mean? Like you said.
Yeah, exactly. Barack Obama waged an air war in Libya. That wasn't with drones. That was with planes with pilots.
So in total,
he also backed Alqaeda's suicide bombers who attacked, in Libya and in Syria for years. So how many suicide bombings at the hands of al-Nusra backed by the CIA equals a drone strike?
That's true. That's exact. I guarantee he dropped way more bombs. I mean, there's just no way. There's no way he's even close. I'm sorry. There's no way. It's just not. I think honestly that they're framing it that way intentionally to mislead, because the thing is, they're both obviously imperial. And like you mentioned, they're both, when it's convenient, anti-war in certain places. When it's easy, like you said, Trump was opposed to war. But if you look at drones, if you look at bombs, if you look at missile strikes, if you look at suicide bombers, I mean, would you say that Obama, except for maybe World War II, dropped more just explosives, I guess let's define it that way, than any other president? I mean, because he dropped, 26,000 bombs in his last year of office.
Does that even... he certainly outpaced W. Bush. No, Vietnam. You said World War II. No, Korea and Vietnam, they dropped more bombs, just Laos, than they dropped in all of World War II, man.
Wasn't there 1 million people from Laos who died? Or am I incorrect in saying that?
Yeah, it's something like 3 million Vietnamese and then 1 million Laotians and Cambodians each, something like that.
From the whole Vietnam War, right?
Yeah.
That's insane. You're talking about 3 to 4 million people. That's on a scale that's just insane. And I wonder how many, I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, but more American soldiers died in Vietnam than Iraq, correct?
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay. 58,000 American soldiers died in Vietnam. We had about 4,500 Americans died in Iraq War II.
Can I ask one thing that I'm very curious about? Because ever since 1991, and I follow this a lot, even I have advocated for it. What is the obsession with Somalia? It's not like Somalia has tons of resources, anything like
location. It's the Horn of Africa. There, it's the Bab al-Mandeb is the gates of the Red Sea. So it's a strategic choke point there. Although it's not like anybody is threatening to close it, anybody in Somalia or anywhere else. I mean, if you read enough already, in fact, if you go to antiwar.com/Scott, I posted my Somalia chapter as an antiwar.com article not too long ago. So you can find it's another 20-year, another failed 20-year war, American Somalia.
Yeah, it's also to your question, Kareem. It's like, why did they do it to any of these countries? Why did they like
any of these?
Do you remember General Wesley Clark? What he said in like 2006? I could be wrong about the date, but it's somewhere around then. He said that one of his advisors came to him and said the Pentagon and the Bush administration they're planning to go to war with Iraq, and then he said, Iraq? Why are we going to war with Iraq? And then he came back a day later and said, you won't believe it, Wesley Clark. We're going to war with Iraq, Sudan, Somalia, and some countries we didn't invade. But it was 7 total countries.
Syria, and Iran.
And almost all of them we did indeed bomb/invade, which is like, I mean, there it is. There it is. That was the plan.
Hey, that's Ariel Sharon's list of enemies, pal. That doesn't come from the United States of America. That is straight out of Israel. And you can see Ariel Sharon says, oh, now that you've invaded Iraq, you better hit Iran and Syria next. And you can see where John Bolton goes, don't worry, Mr. Sharon. Now that we've hit Iraq, we're going to hit Iran and Syria next. This is, from the very beginning, when Clark tells that story, he's talking about the neoconservatives. He's talking about Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, Abram Shulsky, and their group inside the Pentagon. They're the ones who were coming up with that hit list. And those are not America's enemies. And not one of those countries was tied to Al-Qaeda. Not one of those countries had a thing to do with the September 11th attack on the United States whatsoever. And nothing to do with that at all.
You would pretty much say that Obama just continued that plan. There just wasn't a change in plan, just continued it.
Right.
So
people said, Obama was a secret Muslim from Kenya.
Yeah, no, I didn't believe that.
Bush is all he ever was.
Yeah, he was exactly. Go ahead.
Out of curiosity from an economic standpoint, because I was listening.
Yeah, we didn't talk about that.
I try and tell my libertarian friends this, and you're the one other person other than economist I like who said it, that post Mohammed Saeed Bari, Somalia was in very good shape. I mean, they had cell phones. They were investing in them. Do you think if the UN never got involved, Ethiopia never got involved in things, that they'd be one of the most thriving countries?
I mean, weren't they at the top of the UN indicators of all sub-Saharan African countries at one point in 7 different categories?
Yeah, I mean, what happened essentially was, after the fall of the communist regime, all different warlords fought over power in the country throughout the 1990s. And by the end of it, they were all just exhausted and nobody won. And nobody had the ability to lord it over the rest of the country. So Somaliland and Puntland in the north essentially seceded or declared full autonomy from the south. And in the south of the country, basically no one was in charge. And so they kind of devolved back to pre-communist tribal customs. And so the imams and the uncles and the grandfathers and the elders in the village essentially took charge of, policing disputes. And that was it. So then that meant the ports of Kismayo and Mogadishu were wide open. Nobody's collecting taxes. And so people are making money. They're completely on the upswing. I mean, it's hard to say what the counterfactual would have been.
Yeah.
But what did happen was right after September 11th, Bush sent JSOC and the CIA to start murdering people and to start hiring warlords to murder people. And one of the warlords they hired was actually the son of Adid, who was the bad guy during Black Hawk Down in 1993, the guy that they were going to capture when they got caught in that mess. And then W. Bush comes in and hires that guy's son. And then the mandate is hunt down and kill Islamists for me.
Oh, my God.
You can read this in the Post. I name them in the book. It's all in the book. But you can read in the Washington Post that there were 3 suspects wanted for questioning. Because remember, before September 11th, Al-Qaeda terrorism was a job for the FBI. Because it was the FBI that was sent to investigate the Cole attack and the embassy attacks. And there were 3 men wanted for questioning by the FBI. They weren't even suspects, with an arrest warrant out. They were wanted for questioning in the case of the Cole bombing. And Bush and Cheney said, oh, well, those 3 alleged possible guys with knowledge of the Cole attack, that counts as an Al-Qaeda presence in the country. And so Somalia is part of the war on terrorism. And once the CIA started backing the warlords to hunt down Islamists, then the Islamists, essentially got more and more powerful as people rallied to their side against their oppressors. And by 2005, war is the health of the state. By 2005, 13 different groups came together to form the Islamic Courts Union to unite to force the warlords out of the country. And they did. And they forced them into Ethiopia. And then the next year, W. Bush sponsored the Ethiopian invasion, which came in and quickly destroyed the government in the Islamic Courts Union. And then Al-Shabaab, which had been the weakest part of the insurgents, part of the Islamic Courts Union, they were the youth. It means Al-Shabaab actually means the boys. And they were the youngest and least influential part of the Islamic Courts Union. Their job was to sit there and be quiet until the war broke out, in which case, guess who picked up the rifles to fight? It's the youth. And so that was the birth of the Al-Shabaab insurgency. Didn't even happen until the invasion happened in Christmas of 2009, and Al-Shabaab 2006. And the Al-Shabaab insurgency really broke out in strength in the spring of 2007. So this is, if you're counting, 6.5 years after America went and started messing around, was when Al-Shabaab even became a thing. If you ask anybody why we're there now, it's because we have to fight Al-Shabaab. When that was purely a result of the war that George Bush had started. And this is the part that pisses me off. I remember when I first found this out, I was so upset that time was running out on the W. Bush regime. It was 2008, and they had to tie up all their loose ends and get the hell out of town. And so Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State, made a deal that said that the guy that we had overthrown, Sheikh Sharif was his name, who had been the leader of the Islamic Courts Union, we go ahead and let him be the president after all. Never mind the last 2 years of war crimes, the slaughter and rape and murder and mass death and people being burned and exploded to death. We'll go ahead and let the guy that we overthrew be the president, but only in the form of the new national government that we created for them, not their government that they wanted. Well, he accepted the deal, but Al-Shabaab called him a traitor for making a deal with the Americans and stayed at war. So,
wow. Question, Scott.
They didn't have to do this at all. And they said, in fact, there's a quote from the WikiLeaks where the damn State Department lady says, well, we decided that we preferred that a weakened Sheikh Sharif would be a preferable outcome at this point. And these people, again, back to the thing about if we were talking about the Russians, or the Iranians, an enemy government that operates in the way that the United States government operates, we'd probably go to war against them. Yeah. Certainly denounce them as the worst force of violence and evil on the planet. And you cannot make up the level of cynicism and cruelty of the American War Party. They just don't give a damn. And an important part of the Somalia war story is that they've suffered 3 major famines since the war. And that's in 2010 through 12, in 2017. And there's one going on, in the last couple of years, which includes even a plague of locusts, which you won't be surprised is also Barack Obama's fault, because Barack Obama's war in Yemen ended up closing the University of Sana'a, where the graduate students had a program where they went out every spring and murdered grasshoppers. Well, when the grasshopper culling campaign was canceled, they turned into a plague of locusts, crossed the Red Sea, and wiped out crops all across the Horn of Africa there in the last few years. So they're now on their 3rd major famine in Somalia. In Ethiopia, they've now had a civil war and their own problems there. But through most of this time, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, they suffered the same droughts as the Somalis, but they still had, somewhat functioning economies. But because of America's war in Somalia, nobody had any money. Nobody was sowing any crops or harvesting them. There was no market. There was no nothing. The entire distribution, network of food resources in the country was severed. And so people just laid down on the side of the road and died. And by people, of course, that means toddlers. That means people under the age of 5 years old starving to death because George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump and Joe Biden too. And remember, Joe Biden was Obama's vice president during his 8 years. They murdered these people. They starved these people to death. And waging this war against them. This is a country that could never attack us or threaten us or mean harm to us in a million years. People who couldn't possibly be guilty of a threat against the United States of America. And there's just no limit to the amount of cruelty that we can dish out to them for now 22 years straight. And when Donald Trump tried to get out, they told him, no, you can't. And James Mattis, bragged his own telling to the Washington Post is he told Donald Trump, you have no choice. And instead of Donald Trump telling him, you're fired, Donald Trump clicked his heels and saluted and kept the war going. And then at the end of his presidency, he ordered the troops out. But they just said, well, whatever, we're not doing what you say. And they just ignored him. They, moved some troops to Djibouti, and then they bragged about it. Well, now we're commuting to work, which means we bomb Somalia every day from Djibouti instead of from bases in Somalia. And the thing's still going on. And then when Joe Biden came in, one of the first things he did was reverse even that and put the troops right back in and has escalated. You can read antiwar.com and click that cloud link on the right-hand margin there for Somalia, and you can read all about how Joe Biden has massively escalated the air war against those poor people ever since he's taken power as well.
Yeah, no, that's insane. I guess so there's a lot to unpack there because there's 4 presidents who completely destroyed the country, in my opinion. I guess though, one thing that I really look to Somalia as a good thing though, or is that the relative tribal decentralization, which I studied a lot based on something called HERE, which is Somali customary law, and Sharia law did create a very, I'm not going to say to our standards a functional society, but to theirs a really good one. I guess I'm curious to see what would it have been like if they just said, hey, the warlords stop fighting, leave it alone. No equal.
We should try right now. Look, I mean, we're not going to win that war any more than Afghanistan. We're not going to crush the Al-Shabaab insurgency any more than we're going to crush the Taliban. It's over. We lost. Forget it. And then is there any reason to think that Al-Qaeda is going to take over the country? No. And in fact, there's an analyst from the Council on Foreign Relations named Bronwyn Bruton who talked about how in the mid-1990s, there was a bin Ladenite type group that popped their head up in southern Somalia. And the locals just killed them. Yep. We're not going to tolerate that shit around here, man. You guys beat it. And look, Al-Shabaab never took any Saudi money and called themselves Al-Qaeda until 2012, after they got kicked out of the port of Kismayo. And the Saudis go, look, we'll give you a sack of gold coins and some Toyotas, but you got to start calling yourself Al-Qaeda. But even then, the guy who was their leader, who was closest to Saudi and started calling himself Al-Qaeda, they killed him. His name was Godane, and he died in a drone strike in like 2009. So what are we even talking about here? I mean, pardon me, not 2009, in 13 or 14. So there's just, the whole thing is completely crazy, man. And I've spoken with on the show, I interviewed a guy who was, a military, intelligence officer or some such over there, who just, he's told me exactly the same thing I'd have told you. We absolutely cannot win this war unless you want to send, the entire U.S. Army to go and completely eradicate these people, which nobody's willing to do. Then give it up, call it off.
I'm actually willing to even make a bolder claim, which is, I think, at least from my perspective, after they got rid of Syed Bar, I'll even go a step further. That form of government might be ideal to say, fine, we're going to just get the village elders and use customary law and figure stuff out, and we're going to get rid of all central institutions.
Either way, it's up to them. Either way, we got no right whatsoever.
No, I'm saying we try and look at that as a model for how we can implement local government here. Like, I don't need the state government. I don't need the feds. We're a common law, autonomous zone. Stay away from me. We have the Sharia law, thing there. We get along, and we have different customary laws and
Sure.
we get along.
Look, I agree with that. Ultimately, I don't spend a lot of time on like libertarian theory and how I really would like it to be. I'm more concerned with trying to stop the worst things on the margin, that are going on, and all other things being equal. We're stuck with the American national government, but we really need to make it stop doing the things that it's doing to people overseas. It's the worst thing about our country. I mean, what can you say? It's mass murder. And
do we have to be stuck with it? I mean, we can. I've seen Texas secession movements. Even I'm not a fan of Marjorie Taylor Greene all the time, but like even her and John Podesta.
Well, I'm not against it. Like I say, look, I'm never going to argue against reducing government down to nothing. You know what I mean? Texas wants to secede. I support that. I'm not arguing against ultimate libertarian solutions. I'm just saying that, my focus tends to just be on opposing all the worst things first. And to be terribly fatalistic about it, I'm pretty sure on the day I died, the USA will still be the world empire, or will be, probably the single most powerful nation state on the planet in with some peers and near peers. When America died in 2004, it was at the height of American military.
But the dollar's about to collapse.
No matter what he said.
But my question actually be, Scott, like, I mean, I don't know your age. I can speculate, but, I can say that I don't think the dollar has another 10 more years. So, and I don't think the U.S. can be an empire if the dollar is reduced to.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about all that stuff, man. I mean, the thing of it is, the dollar's got a lot of problems, but every national government on the planet is exactly like the U.S. government, and they only know how to do one thing, and that is print money.
Okay.
So, I saw a funny thing on Twitter where the Indians were telling the Russians, yeah, we'll happily pay you in rupees.
Oh, yeah.
They're like, well, actually, maybe you could pay us in yuan or dollars or something. And then we had a funny take on Twitter and said, yeah, everybody is a multipolarist until the first time someone tries to pay them in rupees. Right. So we'll see how all that goes. Remember after 2008, in the crash of 2008, they said, yeah, we're going to come up with a new global currency. It'll be a market basket of currencies, and we'll have some yen and some yuan and some rubles and some whatever. That didn't take.
No.
Because the US dollar might suck, but everybody else's currency also sucks, and in many, many cases, much worse. And so overall, over time, depending on what time period you want to, stab on your chart there, the dollar is a relatively stable and strong currency compared to what just about everybody else on the planet is doing.
We had 3 bank collapses of like major banks.
Okay,
well,
but
still, relative to these other countries' currencies, like for example, in Argentina, they have inflation over 100%. There's countries like Argentina that have over 100% inflation. So relative to our inflation
cycle, but that doesn't mean our dollar's going to break, right? We had a massive crash in 1999 and 2000, and a massive crash in 2008. That just made the dollar stronger. Everybody fled from stocks into dollars. So, and it's guaranteed basically that it's going to be worth the same thing next week as it is right now, right? Like even during a period of high inflation, we never have triple digit inflation.
No.
Ever, right? We never have quadruple digit inflation like America helped inflict on Russia, which is absolutely decimates, the complete destruction of currency. We could have that, but I'm just saying, and I'm not saying that dollars are gold. I'm the biggest critic of the Fed myself, but I'm just saying everybody else also has a central bank, and everybody else's central bank is just like ours. They print money all damn day. Yeah. And so if you are the chief of the central bank of Zambia, whose currency are you going to keep in your vault? Rupees, or rubles, or yuan, or yen, or dollars.
Bitcoin, because my dollar's worth nothing. At the end of the
day, they choose dollars. So far, that they've chosen dollars, and that could change. And I think clearly the way that the U.S. lords its power around and uses sanctions against people all the time gives them a huge incentive to want to get out of the dollar so that we can't reach out and touch them in that way and control their economies in that way. That's a very difficult process.
Okay, but one thing, Scott, is I do a lot of cryptocurrency and DeFi presentations, and that's kind of one thing I do. I bought Bitcoin, sold it, play around with it, and a lot of these African nations, Argentina and all this stuff, now they're like, okay, my currency's super inflated.
Yeah, El Salvador adopted it.
Yeah, El Salvador getting Bitcoin. I'm not saying there should be a world reserve currency, but if it is, I'd prefer it be Bitcoin or Ethereum or something.
Hey, I'm fine with that.
But you got to understand, Kareem, when you're looking at these poor nations, they don't have the infrastructure to have Bitcoin on a mass scale yet. They just don't have the technological capacity yet. I'm not saying it will never happen, but also part of the problem is like, it's partly because we're causing their countries to destabilize, or, U.S. allies. It's like, oh, let's look at one of these countries. Like out of the basket of 7 countries, Wesley Clark detailed, like, have they even had a remote chance to be able to build up their economy, stabilize relations within the society, lower civic tensions and stuff like that? But
look, as long as the government central banks are inflating, then Bitcoin is like tech stocks. It booms and busts and booms and busts and booms and busts. You can't run a sovereign currency on something that was worth $67,000 yesterday and is worth $16,000 today. US dollars don't do that. Bitcoin went from 67 to 16 in the last year, dude.
I mean, that's okay. That's what markets do. They go up and down.
The US dollar doesn't do that. No,
exactly.
By the Fed, there's fixed interest rates. That's the problem.
But it's the degree to which it like. Listen, the US dollar went all the way up to 10% inflation, maybe 12% or 9%. I think.
Wait a minute, I think you guys need to hash this out because I don't know enough about Bitcoin, and it's been 3 hours, and I got to eat some dinner.
All right. Well, before you're good. I was going to end it anyways. Kareem kept going though. But before we end it, Scott, do you want to shout anything out? Shout out your book. Shout out everything you want to shout out. And
everybody read my books. Fool's Errand, Enough Already, Antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, and Scott Horton Show on Twitter, and scotthorton.org. I got 6,000 interviews going back 20 years for you there at scotthorton.org.
I also want to make a recommendation to you. I think you should go on the Tim Pool show. He does a podcast.
I've been on there once, but
you got to go on there, dude. I'm serious.
No, they got to invite me to go on. It's not up to me.
That's true. Your foreign policy expertise is what very much needed on the show.
I mean, when I went there, he didn't know who I was, so he just wanted to talk Fauci and the germ the whole time. And I'm like, well, this is not really my area of expertise, but
you got to go on and talk foreign policy. You got to, because that show needs it. But anyways, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. I'd like to have you on again. Great guest. Kareem, is there anything you want to shout out before we end it?
No, just say I'm Kareem Mays. I'm an organizer of the Mises Caucus. I'm running for school board, and you can find me on the Essential Libertarian. Scott, it was a pleasure talking to you again. We'll see what happens I'm not an economist myself, so we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you guys again.
Great to talk to you guys too. Have a great night.